still crumbling fresh. Limestone substrate, common enough in these parts, except the collapse pattern was wrong. Sinkholes form gradually, with warning signs, sagging ground, circular depressions, dying vegetation in telltale rings. This one had appeared between our Tuesday reconnaissance and Thursday survey, torn open like something had punched through from underneath rather than settled from above. I crouched at the edge, clay still damp and raw, while Bennett photographed the GPS coordinates and Rodriguez deployed ground-penetrating radar. The cavity descended at least 40 feet before the signal scattered into noise, which shouldn't happen. Limestone caves have structure, readable geometry. This read like static. That's when the first tree fell. The crack echoed from perhaps 200 yards northeast. Unmistakable sound of wood rupturing under sudden stress. Not wind damage. The air remained absolutely motionless, heavy with that pre-storm pressure that makes your ears ache. Through the bare November branches I watched a mature oak tilt, root ball tearing from earth, and crash through the understory with the grinding finality of something irreversible. Bennett looked up from his camera. Rodriguez kept staring at his radar screen, but his thumb had gone white on the device's edge. 20 seconds later, another tree fell. This one farther west, maybe 300 yards, the same catastrophic failure. No lightning, no visible rot, just sudden structural collapse as if something enormous had shouldered it aside. I pulled out my field notebook, hands steady from years of recording data in uncomfortable situations, and sketched the rough geometry. 2 trees down, the sinkhole is vertex. They formed a 120-degree arc, equidistant from our position. My pen stopped mid-stroke. Nothing in nature moves in perfect geometric patterns. Rodriguez finally spoke, voice thin. Seismic activity, underground collapse propagating outward. I checked the portable seismograph. Microtremors, yes, but irregular. They pulsed in waves that matched no tectonic signature I'd studied. And I'd studied them all after that bridge project in Cincinnati, where we'd missed pre-failure subsidence by 3 days. These tremors came in sets of 3. Pause. 3 more. Pause. Almost rhythmic, almost deliberate. Bennett suggested we pack it in, come back with a larger crew, but the contract specified preliminary assessment by end of week, and something in me, professional pride or simple stubbornness, insisted on completing the perimeter measurements. We split up, each taking a third of the circle, maintaining radio contact. The forest floor felt wrong underfoot. That's the only way I can articulate it. Soil that should have been firm after dry weather instead compressed with each step. Not quite muddy but yielding, as if something had recently disturbed the ground's internal structure. I marked waypoints every 20 meters, noting vegetation stress, soil samples, decline angles. Good, solid topographic data. Real. Measurable. Except the measurements kept shifting. First waypoint, elevation 847 feet. Double-checked. Then at my 4th waypoint, when I triangulated back to confirm initial readings, my laser rangefinder insisted the first position now sat at 844 feet. 3-foot elevation change in 15 minutes, on ground that showed no signs of settlement. I radioed Bennett. Static answered, then his voice, fragmented. Seeing that too, readings aren't. Rodriguez found something. Repeat, Bennett. You're breaking up. Dead air. My radio still showed full battery, all channels clear. The forest had gone silent. In that particular way, that means predators nearby, when even the insects hold perfectly still. I started back toward the sinkhole, trying to raise either colleague on the radio, checking my GPS track to ensure I followed my own path precisely. The waypoint markers I'd left, bright orange flags on wire stakes, had been removed. All of them, not blown away or knocked over, but extracted cleanly, the wire slightly bent as if pulled by gloved hands. Except no one had come out here. We would have seen them. My radio crackled. Back at the hole, you need to see the marks. Rodriguez, maybe. The voice had been stripped down to pure anxiety. I found them both at the sinkhole's western edge, crouched over something in the mud. The limestone substrate's exposed edge, where erosion had washed topsoil away, showed a series of parallel grooves, deep ones. They ran from the tree line straight to the cavity's rim and simply stopped, as if whatever made them had thrown itself into the darkness or emerged from it. Not bear tracks, not deer, certainly not human boot treads. These gouges measured nearly a foot wide, but the spacing was wrong, the gait impossible. Nothing that heavy could move quietly, could coordinate that precisely through dense forest. Bennett had gone pale under his field tan. "I saw them form," he whispered. "I was checking the northern quadrant and these just appeared in the mud. Like something was already there but invisible, and the marks caught up to reality." Rodriguez pointed at his radar screen, though his hand shook badly enough that the image blurred. "Cavities expanding. Look, 43 feet deep now. It was 40 at our first scan. I checked my watch. 16:12. We'd been here 90 minutes. Sinkholes don't actively grow that fast without audible collapse, without falling debris, without any indication of ongoing structural failure." Something moved in my peripheral vision, that specific flicker your hindbrain registers before conscious thought. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing visible, yet every instinct I possessed screamed at me that something enormous occupied the space between the trunks, something that understood camouflage at a level beyond animal cunning. "We should leave," I said quietly. "Document from the office. Send the data to the state geologist. Recommend restricted access until proper survey." "What do we tell them?" Bennett's voice cracked. "That trees are falling in geometric patterns? That sinkholes grow while we watch? That something left tracks but we never saw what made them?" A fair question. Our profession runs on empirical data, measurable phenomena, reproducible results. Topographers don't write reports about the forest feeling wrong, about spaces occupied by nothing visible, about the weight of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. We packed our equipment with the efficient haste of people who've decided on retreat, but won't admit to fleeing. My hands kept steady, muscle memory from years of fieldwork, while my thoughts ran in tight spirals. The GPS coordinates would guide us back to the service road where we'd parked the truck, a straight shot northwest through a quarter-mile of forest. Except when I pulled up the waypoint, the device showed our vehicle's position had moved. Not drastically, maybe 40 yards south, but we'd left that truck locked on level ground, parking brake engaged, key in my pocket. I checked the key, still there, reassuringly solid and real. "Let me see your GPS," I said to Rodriguez. His device showed the same thing. The truck had moved, or the forest had moved around it. Or our instruments were experiencing simultaneous calibration failure from some localized electromagnetic anomaly, which would explain the radio static, the shifting elevation readings, the expanding cavity measurements. That explanation felt like holding up paper against a hurricane. We started walking. I kept my compass heading precise, 130 degrees magnetic, counting paces for dead reckoning backup. The forest canopy seemed denser than before, though that made no sense on November bare branches. Light filtering down had taken on that peculiar quality of late afternoon in autumn, gold transitioning to amber, shadows reaching out like grasping fingers. Rodriguez stopped walking. "Listen." I heard it then, a sound from behind us, from the direction of the sinkhole, rhythmic scraping, like something massive dragging itself across stone. It came in bursts, scrape, 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 pause, scrape, 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 pause. The same 3-beat pattern as the seismic tremors. Bennett started moving faster, not quite running but close. I caught his arm. "Stay together. Stay visible to each other. Don't let that thing..." I stopped, because saying it out loud would make it real, would force us to acknowledge we'd crossed some threshold from rational terrain survey into something else entirely. "Don't let what?" Bennett demanded. "We don't even know what it is. Maybe it's equipment failure. Maybe we're all exhausted and interpreting normal forest sounds as..." A tree fell directly across our path. Not ahead of us, not behind. Directly across the line we would have walked in 30 seconds. The oak came down with that same catastrophic suddenness, root ball erupting from earth, trunk slamming through the understory to block our route completely. We stood frozen, three grown men with technical degrees and professional certifications, staring at timber that had just tried to cut us off from our vehicle. Because that's what it felt like. Not accident, not coincidence, but deliberate interception. Around it, I managed. Give it wide berth, maintain heading. We circled south, stepping over smaller deadfall, pushing through brush that caught at our field vests with spiteful persistence. My GPS track showed we were paralleling the correct course, maybe 20 yards off target. Acceptable deviation. The truck's waypoint remained steady now, right where we'd left it, and I clung to that stability like a drowning man grips driftwood. Rodriguez stumbled, caught himself, looked down at what he'd tripped over. Another set of those gouges in the leaf litter, this time showing drag marks as if something had pulled itself along the ground. The tracks ran perpendicular to our path, disappeared into dense underbrush. How many of these things were there? The question formed ice in my chest because one unknown entity felt manageable, explicable. Multiple unknowns suggested coordination, intelligence, purpose. The scraping sound had stopped. In its absence, the forest felt even more oppressive. Pressing close with the weight of held breath, I found myself listening for the smallest indication of position. A snapped twig, displaced leaves, anything that would tell me where the threat waited. Nothing. Perfect, impossible silence. We emerged from the tree line at 1647, exactly where the GPS indicated, and the truck sat undisturbed on the gravel service road, dusty white paint reflecting late sun, tire tracks still fresh in the dirt. Normal, real. I wanted to weep with relief at something so mundanely, perfectly ordinary. Bennett moved toward the driver's door. I grabbed his shoulder. Check the perimeter first. He gave me a look that questioned my sanity, but Rodriguez understood. We walked around the vehicle, checking for... what? Damage? Evidence of tampering? More of those impossible tracks? The road showed our arrival marks. Nothing else. Just gravel and dust and the worn ruts of Forest Service maintenance vehicles. I unlocked the truck. We loaded equipment in silence, each of us touching the solid metal frame as if to confirm its reality. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine. It caught immediately, dashboard lights glowing their normal amber and green, and shifted into gear. My eyes caught movement in the rearview mirror. For just an instant, before my conscious mind could process what I was seeing, something stood at the tree line. Something massive and wrong and geometrically impossible. Something that occupied too much space while simultaneously being nothing I could focus on directly. The shape suggested limbs, but too many. Angles that bent in directions that hurt to consider. A presence so fundamentally other that my brain refused to commit it to memory. Then it was gone. Just shadows between trees, normal forest, empty space. I drove. Rodriguez beside me stared straight ahead. Bennett in the back seat gripped his camera like a lifeline. None of us spoke until we reached the highway, until pavement replaced gravel, until traffic and power lines and cell towers re-established the familiar architecture of human civilization. At the county planning office, I filed a preliminary report recommending further geological assessment before declaring the site accessible. Technical language, professional observations, no mention of trees falling in patterns or tracks that shouldn't exist. The state geologist accepted the data, scheduled a comprehensive survey for spring when ground conditions would be more favorable. I've returned 3 times since, never got closer than the service road. Each time the GPS coordinates guide me to the exact same spot, but the forest looks different, not changed, different, as if reality were a photograph developing in solution, image emerging, but never quite resolving. The truck's odometer shows the correct distance. My field notes confirm the location. Everything matches except the essential truth of the place itself. The seismograph data, when I analyzed it properly in the lab, showed those 3 beat patterns continuing for 6 hours after we left. Rhythmic, steady, patient. Then they stopped exactly at sunset, precise to the minute. Bennett quit surveying, took a desk job in Columbus. Rodriguez still works contracts, but never in that region, never in isolated terrain. He mentioned once, in a bar after too many beers, that he sees those tracks sometimes when he closes his eyes, deep gouges leading nowhere, or everywhere, or into spaces that exist beside our world, but separate from it. I keep the field notebook in my desk drawer. Sometimes late at night, when the office is empty and streetlights cast amber pools through the windows, I open it to that sketch, the two fallen trees, the sinkhole, the geometric arc that suggested something massive moving with impossible precision. I've tried to convince myself it was psychological, a shared delusion born of fatigue and isolation, and the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. But I remember Rodriguez's words, before we stopped discussing what happened. Maybe it wasn't trying to hurt us. Maybe it was just curious, wondering what we were, what we'd do if it showed itself, whether we'd understand. I don't know what's worse. The thought that something that vast and alien exists in the limestone caverns beneath Ohio farmland, or the possibility that it's still curious about us, that someday it might decide to complete the pattern, to step fully into our world rather than merely pressing against it from the other side. The state geologist's survey is scheduled for April. They'll use ground-penetrating radar, seismic imaging, maybe even send a team into the cavity if it's stable enough. Professional equipment, multiple witnesses, empirical data that will either confirm or debunk everything we experienced. Part of me hopes they find nothing but ordinary limestone and natural erosion. The rest of me knows they won't. They'll find the hollow expanding, the tracks multiplying, the pattern growing more complex as whatever waits down there learns our rhythms, maps our movements, decides whether we're worth the effort of being seen. And on some evening when shadows grow long and seismographs register 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again, someone else will stand at that crater's edge and feel what we felt. The weight of attention from something that exists in the spaces between topographic measurements. Something patient and vast and utterly indifferent to our need for the world to make sense. I've stopped sleeping well. Every time I close my eyes, I see that shape in the rearview mirror. The thing that was and wasn't. The presence my memory refuses to hold. I tell myself it was fatigue, stress, the human brain's tendency to manufacture meaning from ambiguous stimuli. But I check my GPS every morning, just to confirm I'm still where I'm supposed to be, still anchored to coordinates that match reality. And some mornings, for just a moment before the satellite's lock signal, the screen shows me somewhere else entirely, deep underground, beneath layers of limestone and clay and the accumulated sediment of millennia, in darkness, absolute and measureless. Then the signal stabilizes, and I'm back in my apartment, back in the ordinary world of traffic and coffee and schedules. Back where things follow rules, where ground stays solid, where shadows are cast by light instead of being the substance themselves. I tell myself I believe that. Some days, I almost do. Story 2. The chalk dust settled in my lungs like cemetery ash. I'd been climbing the Red River Gorge for 7 years, and I thought I knew every inch of those sandstone walls. The way the rock felt under your fingertips. Rough, honest, predictable. The way sound carried through the hollows, bouncing off stone faces that had watched climbers for decades. But that October afternoon taught me something else entirely. That rock remembers things we'd rather forget. We arrived at the trailhead just after noon, the autumn sun filtering through trees that hadn't quite committed to letting go of their leaves. My climbing partner, I'll call him Jay, was in good spirits, cracking jokes about my new harness as we hiked toward the cliff face. His girlfriend trailed behind us, camera in hand, documenting the expedition for some social media audience I'd never understand. The 3 of us had climbed together maybe a dozen times before, always the same dynamic. Jay leading, his girlfriend belaying from below, and me cleaning up the roots after them. The route we'd chosen was called Pale Communion, a 5.10 B slab that most locals considered a warm-up. 60 feet of smooth sandstone with minimal holds, the kind of climb that demands balance over strength, faith over fear. The name had always struck me as vaguely religious, though I'd never thought to ask about its origin. Standing at the base that afternoon, staring up at the featureless expanse of stone, I felt something shift in my peripheral vision. Just a flutter, like fabric caught in wind where there was no fabric, no wind. Jay went up first, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this route 100 times. His girlfriend took photos from below, the shutter clicks punctuating the otherwise silent forest. When he reached the top and secured the anchor, he called down that the rock was dry, the holds were good. Everything was perfect. My turn. I tied in, checked my knot 3 times, a ritual I'd never broken, and started up. The first 20 feet went smoothly. My fingers found the subtle divots in the stone. My feet trusted the friction. My breathing stayed even. This was meditation, muscle memory, the closest thing to flying that humans could manage without actually leaving the ground. At 30 feet, the slab became smoother. The holds grew smaller, more psychological than physical, mere suggestions of grip that required absolute commitment. I pressed my chest against the cool sandstone, spreading my weight, feeling the rock's texture through my shirt. The forest below had gone quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing and the distant murmur of Jay's voice from above, though I couldn't make out the words. 40 feet up, I froze. It wasn't fear exactly. I'd been afraid on climbs before, that electric jolt when your foot slips or a hold crumbles. This was different. This was the sensation of being watched, of having crossed into space that wasn't meant for me. The hair on my neck stood up despite the exertion heat. I glanced down at Jay's girlfriend, who was staring at her phone screen rather than belaying properly. A habit that usually annoyed me, but which now felt like a small betrayal, as if her inattention had opened a door I couldn't see. I reached for the next hold, a shallow pocket barely deep enough for 2 fingers. My hand was shaking. Not from pump or fatigue, but from something else. Something that had lodged itself in my chest and was slowly tightening. The rock felt wrong under my touch, warmer than it should be, almost pulsing, though I knew that was impossible. Stone doesn't pulse. Stone doesn't breathe. 50 feet. The crux was just above me now, a nearly blank section where the route forced you to trust pure friction, to commit your entire body weight to stone that offered nothing in return. Jay had made it look easy, but then, Jay hadn't felt what I was feeling. That presence, that attention, that thing that was definitely not my imagination, because my imagination had never been this specific, this insistent, this real. I made the move, pushed up on my toes, extended my right hand toward a small crystal formation that would serve as the final hold before easier terrain. My left foot started to slip. The rubber of my climbing shoe began its slow, inevitable slide down the polished slab. I felt my center of gravity shift backward, felt the rope go tight as my weight came off the wall. Time did that thing it does in moments of crisis, stretched out, became liquid, showed me every terrible second of the fall that was about to happen, 60 feet of air below me. Jay's girlfriend distracted, the rope running through quick draws that suddenly seemed far too spaced apart. Then the pressure, right between my shoulder blades, firm and unmistakable. A hand, not shoving, not grabbing, just present, just there, just enough to shift my weight forward, to keep my center of mass against the rock instead of arcing away from it. The pressure held me for maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, long enough for me to reset my foot, to redistribute my weight, to complete the move I'd thought was lost. I didn't look behind me. Couldn't. My body was locked in survival mode, every muscle engaged in the simple task of not falling. I finished the route in a blur of motion that felt more like being pulled than climbing, like something was guiding my hands to holds I couldn't see, my feet to friction points I hadn't planned. When I reached the anchor and clipped in, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely manage the carabiners. Jay was sitting on the plateau, eating an energy bar, completely relaxed. He asked if I was okay, noting that I looked pale. I told him I'd almost fallen on the crux, that something had spooked me. He laughed and said the rock would do that sometimes. Get in your head, make you doubt yourself. His girlfriend called up from below, asking if she should come up or if we were done for the day. That's when I saw it. While Jay was breaking down the anchor, I moved along the lip of the cliff, looking back down at the route I'd just climbed. And there, at exactly the spot where I'd nearly fallen, at exactly 50 feet off the ground, too high for anyone below to reach, too far from the natural line of the route for any previous climber to have left it, was a handprint in chalk. Not my handprint. I'd been moving fast through that section, barely using chalk at all. This was deliberate, pressed into the stone with purpose. The fingers were splayed, the palm distinct, the whole thing positioned right where my back had been when I felt that pressure, that presence, that impossible hand that had kept me from falling. I called Jay over. He studied it for a long moment, then shrugged and said someone must have done a different variation of the route, maybe traversed in from the side. But we both knew the cliff face. There was no side traverse, no way to reach that spot except by climbing directly through it, and no reason for anyone to stop there and press their chalk-covered hand against the rock in the middle of a difficult section. Jay's girlfriend yelled up again, impatient. Jay started rappelling. I stood there staring at that handprint, feeling something cold settle into my bones despite the afternoon warmth. The print was large, larger than mine, larger than Jay's. The fingers were long, almost too long, the proportions slightly off in a way that made my eyes hurt if I looked at it too directly. I took a photo with my phone. The image came out blurred, unfocused, as if the camera couldn't quite capture what it was seeing. I took another. Same result. The handprint was clear to my naked eye but refused to resolve in the digital frame, like it existed in a wavelength my phone couldn't process. We hiked out as the sun started its descent, shadows lengthening between the trees. Jay and his girlfriend chatted about dinner plans, about other routes we should try tomorrow. I didn't tell them about the handprint, about the wrongness of it, about the way my back still felt warm where that pressure had been, like something had left a mark I couldn't see. That night, in the cheap motel room I'd rented for the weekend, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it again. That hand, that pressure, that presence. Not threatening exactly, but not comforting either. Just there. Just watching. Just waiting for something I couldn't name. I got up at 2 a.m. and opened my laptop, searching for information about Pale Communion. Most of what I found was standard route beta, difficulty ratings, gear recommendations, photos of other climbers on the slab. But buried in a climbing forum from 2003, I found a thread I wish I hadn't. A climber named TR had posted about a strange experience on the same route. He described nearly falling at exactly the same spot, around 50 feet. He described feeling something steady him, something he couldn't explain. And he described finding a handprint in chalk afterward, positioned where no handprint should be. Several people had responded to his post, most dismissing it as imagination or misremembering. But one response, from a user whose account had been deleted, caught my attention. That route isn't named for the rock. It's named for what the rock remembers. Leave an offering next time. They get angry when you don't. The thread ended there. No follow-up from TR. No explanation of what offering meant or who they were. Just that cryptic sentence, hanging in digital space like a warning no one had heeded. I tried to find more information about TR, about other incidents on that route. Nothing. It was as if the internet had scrubbed itself clean of any mention of what might be lurking on that sandstone face. Or maybe there was nothing to find. Maybe I was reading patterns into randomness, seeing hands in chalk dust, feeling presence where there was only wind and wishful thinking and the particular madness that comes from spending too much time vertical, too far from solid ground. But my back still felt warm. The next morning, Jay wanted to climb again. Different route, different wall, but I found myself inventing excuses. My shoulder hurt. I'd slept poorly. I needed to drive back early for work that wasn't expecting me until Monday. He seemed disappointed but didn't push it. His girlfriend looked relieved. She'd never been as committed to the climbing as Jay was, had always treated these trips as obligations rather than adventures. I packed my gear and drove out of the Red River Gorge, watching the cliff faces recede in my rearview mirror. The autumn sun made the sandstone glow orange and gold, beautiful and ancient and patient. Rock doesn't care about human schedules, human fears, human questions. Rock just waits. But as I turned onto the highway, I glanced one more time at that distant wall, at the place where pale communion ran up the slab, and I swear, though I know it was impossible at that distance, know it was just a trick of light or exhaustion, or the particular paranoia that had settled into my thoughts. I swear I saw someone standing at the top of the cliff, just a silhouette, too far away to make out features, too far away to be anything but imagination. The figure raised one hand, not waving, just raising it, fingers splayed, palm forward. A gesture that might have been greeting or warning or simple acknowledgement that I had seen what I had seen, felt what I had felt, and would never be entirely certain which version of reality was true. I didn't climb for 3 months after that. Told people I needed a break, that my shoulder was bothering me, that work had gotten busy. All lies. The truth was simpler and stranger. I couldn't stop feeling that hand on my back. Couldn't stop seeing that handprint on the rock. Couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if that presence, whatever it was, had decided to push instead of steady, to let go instead of hold on. When I finally went back to climbing, it was at a different crag, on different stone, with different partners. I never returned to the Red River Gorge. Jay asked me about it once, said he and his girlfriend were planning another trip, wondered if I wanted to join. I made excuses. He stopped asking. Sometimes late at night I pull up that blurred photo from my phone, the handprint that won't quite resolve, that exists in the space between what the camera can capture and what the eye can see. I zoom in, trying to make out details that aren't there, looking for proof of something I simultaneously want to believe and desperately wish I could forget. The fingers are too long. I'm certain of that now. Not by much, just enough to be wrong, to be other, to be something that wears the shape of human without quite achieving it. And if I look at the photo long enough, if I let my eyes unfocus and my mind quiet, I can almost see something else in that chalk dust. Something that might be letters, might be symbols, might be nothing at all, or might be a message I'm not equipped to read. My back still feels warm sometimes, especially when I'm alone, especially when I'm vertical. Not painful, not unpleasant, just there. A reminder that I survived something I don't fully understand, that I was saved by something I can't explain, and that the line between help and harm is sometimes as thin as the difference between a push and a steady hand. I tell myself it was a coincidence, that someone had climbed a variation I didn't know about, that the pressure on my back was my imagination, my muscles compensating, my brain inventing narrative where there was only physics and panic. I tell myself these things, and sometimes I almost believe them. But I also keep a piece of chalk in my pocket now, always. Not for climbing. I haven't touched a rock face in months. Just as a reminder. Just as an offering in case whatever lives in that sandstone ever decides to collect. The rock remembers. That's what the deleted user had said. And maybe they were right. Maybe stone absorbs more than just chalk and sweat and the passage of countless hands reaching for something just beyond their grasp. Maybe it remembers everyone who trusted it, everyone who fell, everyone who needed help and found it in the space between breath and impact, between letting go and holding on. Or maybe I'm just someone who nearly fell once and whose brain has been filling in a story ever since, because humans need stories the way climbers need holds. Something to grasp onto, something to keep us from spinning out into the void where nothing makes sense, and everything is random and there's no hand on your back when you need one most. I don't know which version I believe anymore. But I know this. I'll never climb Pale Communion again. And I'll never stop wondering what would have happened if I'd looked behind me in that moment, if I'd turned my head and seen what was steadying my fall, if I'd met the eyes of whatever leaves handprints in chalk on stone faces too high and too smooth for human reach. Some questions don't have answers, some roots don't have endings, some hands reach out from places we can't map, for reasons we can't understand, and all we can do is accept the help and keep climbing and never ever look back at what's holding us up. The rock remembers, and now, so do I. Story 3. The apartment manager's voice became static in my ears the moment it happened, a thickening in the air itself, as though oxygen had turned viscous. I'd been nodding along to her explanations about utility bills when the shadow moved across the sunlit living room floor, defying every law of physics I'd spent my career understanding. It wasn't the absence of light. It was presence. The thing slid between the manager and me, a column of concentrated darkness that seemed to drink in the afternoon rays streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My skin prickled with a sensation I couldn't name, not quite touch, not quite temperature, but something that registered in the primitive parts of my brain that still remembered when humans were prey. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. And I knew with absolute certainty that whatever had just passed through my new living room was masculine, purposeful, and aware of me. I must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath perhaps, because the manager stopped mid-sentence and followed my gaze. But by then the shadow had dissipated, leaving only the ordinary interplay of light and furniture that belonged in any 10th floor apartment in northern Bogota. She asked if I was feeling well. The altitude, she suggested, affects newcomers in unexpected ways. I assured her I was fine, though my hands had gone cold and my pulse hammered in my throat. After she left, I stood in the center of the living room and rotated slowly, taking in the space I'd chosen precisely because it was practical, modern, and thoroughly unremarkable. The previous tenant had cleared out completely, or so I'd been told. No forwarding address, no final walkthrough. The management company had simply changed the locks after he stopped responding to calls and emails. His security deposit covered the broken lease, and they were eager to fill the unit. I'm a skeptic by training and temperament. I hold a doctorate in computational biology and spent 15 years designing algorithms to model complex systems. I believe in data, replication, and the principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I do not believe in shadows that move independent of light sources. Yet my skin still crawled with the memory of that presence brushing past me. That evening, I unpacked methodically, organizing my belongings with the same systematic approach I brought to my research. Books on evolutionary theory and mathematical modeling filled one shelf. Clothes hung in the closet at precise intervals. My laptop occupied the corner of the dining table that received optimal natural light. Everything in its place, everything rational and ordered. The apartment revealed itself in layers as I settled in. The previous tenant had been thorough in removing his possessions but careless with smaller traces of habitation. I found a USB drive wedged behind the radiator in the second bedroom. 3 books marked with sticky notes occupied the gap between the refrigerator and the cabinet. Titles on atmospheric pressure systems, electromagnetic field theory, and a dog-eared paperback about architectural acoustics. In the bathroom cabinet's back corner, a bottle of prescription medication for anxiety, nearly full, prescribed to someone with the initials DR. The sticky notes interested me most. Their placement seemed deliberate, marking passages that shared common themes, environmental factors that influence human perception, the way certain frequencies interact with inner ear structures, how barometric pressure changes affect mood and cognition. One passage was heavily underlined. The human nervous system evolved to detect threats that no longer exist, creating phantom patterns where none may be present. Reasonable material for someone experiencing stress. Nothing supernatural about it. I told myself this as I prepared for bed that first night, but I left the hallway light on. A concession I refused to examine too closely. The pressure woke me at 3:17 a.m. It started as a sensation of weight settling over my chest. Not painful, but present, like someone had laid a heavy blanket across my torso. Then came the awareness of wrongness in the room's geometry, as though the walls had shifted inward by imperceptible degrees. I lay motionless in the darkness, my rational mind cataloging explanations, sleep paralysis, altitude adjustment, stress from the international move, while a more ancient part of my brain screamed that I was not alone. The presence stood in the corner near the closet. I couldn't see it, not exactly, but I knew it was there with the same certainty I knew my own heartbeat. The air felt compressed, concentrated, the way it does in the moment before lightning strikes. I wanted to reach for the lamp on my nightstand, but my arm wouldn't move. and I couldn't determine if this was paralysis or primal wisdom keeping me still while something predatory occupied my space. Time distorted. Seconds stretched into elastic eternities. The presence didn't move, didn't make sound, but I felt it watching with an attention so focused it had physical weight. My lungs worked in shallow gasps. My body locked in a response pattern coded into human DNA long before we invented words for fear. Then, between one ragged breath and the next, it was gone. The air normalized. The room's proportions returned to their proper dimensions. I could move again, though it took 3 attempts before my shaking hand found the lamp switch. The corner where the presence had stood looked exactly as it had when I went to bed. Empty floor, closed closet door, unremarkable walls. I examined every inch of that space, searching for the rational explanation I knew must exist. Air vent? No, the register was across the room. Pipes in the walls? The plumbing diagram showed none in that section. Electrical field from wiring? Possible, but the building's plans indicated no unusual configurations. I spent the rest of the night on my laptop, researching. Infrasound, low-frequency vibrations below human hearing range, can create feelings of dread and the sensation of a presence. Certain architectural features produce standing waves that affect the human nervous system. Carbon monoxide causes hallucinations. Mold exposure triggers paranoia. By dawn, I'd compiled a list of 17 testable hypotheses and ordered equipment for each. Carbon monoxide detector, EMF reader, infrared thermometer, audio recorder capable of capturing infrasonic frequencies, air quality monitor. Science would explain this. The devices arrived over the next 3 days. I installed them throughout the apartment, creating a monitoring grid that would capture any environmental anomalies. The carbon monoxide detector remained stubbornly at 0. The EMF reader showed nothing beyond the expected readings near outlets and appliances. Air quality was excellent. No mold, no gas leaks, no infrasound that shouldn't exist in any modern building. But the presence returned, and now it brought patterns. It appeared always between 3 and 4 a.m., always in corners or doorways, always with that same sensation of masculine intent. The pressure would build first, a barometric warning my body had learned to recognize even in sleep. Then the wrongness would settle into whatever room I occupied, watching with that terrible focused attention. I started documenting everything: time of occurrence, duration, location, my physiological responses, environmental readings from all my instruments. The data revealed nothing useful. Temperature remained constant, no electromagnetic anomalies, no sound recording captured anything beyond my own accelerated breathing and the ambient noise of a building at night. Yet the experiences intensified. On the 8th night, I felt it following me. I'd gotten up for water and sensed the presence moving through the apartment behind me, staying just outside my peripheral vision, tracking my movements with deliberate interest. The sensation of being stalked in my own home triggered responses. My civilized mind tried to suppress, but my body honored regardless. Hackles rising, breathing shallow, muscles tensed for flight. I spun around 3 times trying to catch it, but each time found only empty space and my own racing reflection in darkened windows. The next morning, I discovered the USB drive I'd found had corrupted completely. Every file unrecoverable, reduced to strings of meaningless data. A coincidence, surely, but it joined the other small wrongnesses accumulating around me. Books I'd shelved appearing on different surfaces, the arrangement of items on my desk subtly altered, the faint impression on the living room couch as though someone had been sitting there while I slept. I told no one. Who would I tell? My colleagues knew me as rigorous and rational. Admitting that I felt hunted by something I couldn't measure would destroy my credibility. Besides, I had no evidence beyond subjective experience, the least reliable form of data. Instead, I researched the previous tenant. The management company proved unhelpful, citing privacy policies and legal constraints. But the internet remembers everything. I found him through professional networks, a data analyst named Daniel Restrepo, who'd worked for an environmental monitoring firm. His LinkedIn hadn't been updated in 7 months. His last published report dealt with atmospheric pressure variations in high-altitude cities and their effects on building infrastructure. I found one of his forum posts from 8 months ago, buried in a thread about urban environmental factors. He'd written extensively about what he called pressure points, locations where multiple environmental variables intersected in ways that affected human perception. He'd been careful to frame everything in scientific language, but reading between his measured words, I recognized the subtext. Something in this apartment had been affecting him, something he'd tried to understand through the same empirical methods I was now employing. His final post had been succinct. Some patterns exist outside our current models. This doesn't make them supernatural, only unmeasured. Then silence. No more forum activity, no social media updates, no professional publications, just absence. I tracked down 3 phone numbers associated with him and called them all. 2 were disconnected. The third rang through to voicemail, his voice calm and professional, asking callers to leave a message. I didn't. What would I say? That I'd moved into his apartment and inherited whatever had driven him away. That night I stayed awake deliberately, laptop open, camera recording, every sensor active. If the presence appeared, I would document it properly. No more subjective impressions. I wanted data. 3:22 a.m. The pressure began building. I kept my eyes on the laptop screen, watching the sensor readings, refusing to look toward the corner where I knew it was gathering. Temperature steady. EMF normal. Barometric pressure within expected ranges. Nothing. Nothing. Nothing that would explain the weight settling over the room like a held breath. My camera recorded only empty space, yet I could feel it there, closer than it had ever been. The masculine quality grew more defined, not threatening, exactly, but intensely present, as though someone stood beside my desk, staring at my screen, reading over my shoulder. I typed a single question into a blank document. What do you want? My fingers trembled on the keys. This was absurd, theatrical, the opposite of scientific method, but the presence pressed closer, the air thickening until breathing required conscious effort, and I watched the cursor blink in the silent room. No answer came. No supernatural typing appeared on my screen. But the pressure intensified until it felt like being underwater, and I understood with sudden clarity that whatever shared this space wasn't trying to communicate. It was trying to be noticed, to be acknowledged, to prove its existence to someone who'd built a career on denying anything that couldn't be measured. I closed the laptop. The pressure remained, suffocating now, and I stood up from the desk with the deliberate care of someone trying not to spook a dangerous animal. 2 steps toward the bedroom. The presence shifted with me, staying close. 3 more steps. It matched my movement exactly, an unseen escort whose proximity raised every hair on my arms. Halfway down the hall, I stopped, turned, spoke aloud to the empty corridor. I know you're there. The admission cost something. Pride, certainty, the comfortable confidence of my skeptical worldview. But the moment the words left my mouth, the pressure eased fractionally, and I realized the terrible truth. Acknowledgement was what it wanted. Not belief, not fear, just recognition. I don't understand what you are, I continued, my voice steady despite the cold sweat on my neck. But I acknowledge your presence. The air normalized completely. The weight lifted. The sensation of being watched faded, and I stood alone in my hallway at 3:47 a.m., talking to empty space like someone whose grip on reality had become negotiable. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room watching the windows lighten toward dawn, turning over possibilities. Localized magnetic fields affecting my temporal lobe. Exposure to some undocumented environmental toxin. Stress-induced psychosis. Carbon monoxide poisoning despite the detector's clean readings. Every rational explanation seemed simultaneously plausible and insufficient. Or Daniel Restrepo had been right. Some patterns exist outside our current models. The following week I functioned on the surface, attended meetings, analyzed data, maintained the facade of normalcy. But I'd started documenting everything in a private journal, the same way the previous tenant had filled those margins with notes. I wrote about the pressure patterns, the sensation of being tracked through my own apartment, the growing certainty that something impossible was sharing my space. I found myself marking passages in the books he'd left behind, underlining the same sections he'd highlighted, following the breadcrumb trail of his descent into whatever had made him abandon this place. Environmental pressures, perception filters, the way human consciousness interprets patterns that don't fit our models of reality. One night I discovered his handwritten notes in the margins of the atmospheric pressure book. They weren't dates or citations. They were times: 3:17, 3:22, 3:09, 3:41, a log of visitations. I compared them to my own documented experiences and felt my stomach drop. The patterns matched almost exactly, not just the time range but the specific minutes, as though whatever manifested here operated on some kind of schedule neither of us could predict, but both had experienced identically. The final note he'd written was in the back cover, in handwriting that had deteriorated from his earlier careful script. "It's not trying to harm, it's trying to exist. We're the ones who've forgotten how to perceive it." I stared at those words for 20 minutes, my scientific training warring with the undeniable truth of my accumulated experiences. I'd measured everything measurable and found nothing, yet the presence continued, night after night, patient and persistent in its inexplicable existence. Tonight, as I write this, it's 2:47 a.m. I can feel the pressure beginning to build, the familiar warning that in 30 minutes I'll once again share my space with something that refuses to comply with my understanding of what's possible. My instruments are ready. My documentation is thorough. My rational mind continues insisting there must be an explanation, but I'm beginning to suspect that explanation and understanding might not be the same thing, that the universe might contain patterns our current models can't accommodate. Not because they're supernatural, but because we've trained ourselves not to notice what doesn't fit our equations. Daniel Restrepo left, abandoned his lease, his security deposit, his carefully documented research. Whatever conclusion he reached, it was sufficient to make him walk away from everything rather than continue experiencing what I now experience nightly. I haven't decided yet what I'll do. The pressure is building faster now, more insistent than previous nights. And I wonder if acknowledgement was permission, if admitting I could perceive it has somehow strengthened its presence in ways I didn't anticipate. The corner by the window has grown darker, though my eyes are adjusting to the pre-dawn gloom. No, not darker. Dense, concentrated, a focal point where the air itself seems to gather and compress. I should be afraid. Part of me is, but another part, the part that chose a career built on understanding complex systems, feels something closer to terrible curiosity. This presence has been here all along, I realize. Long before Daniel Restrepo, long before me. Patient and persistent, waiting for occupants who might be able to perceive it. The real question isn't what it is. The real question is why, after all this time, we've convinced ourselves that reality only contains what we can measure, and what we're refusing to acknowledge by maintaining that conviction. The pressure peaks. The presence stands beside my desk now, so close I can feel it like body heat, masculine and purposeful and utterly, impossibly real. My camera captures nothing. My instruments register no anomalies. But every nerve in my body confirms what my scientific training tells me cannot be. I am not alone, and I wonder, as the darkness by the window grows more defined, whether the previous tenant fled because he couldn't accept what he was experiencing, or because he finally understood it, and that understanding was more terrifying than any supernatural explanation could ever be. The cursor blinks. The presence waits, and I sit here in my thoroughly modern apartment, surrounded by instruments that measure everything except what matters, finally understanding why some absences carry more weight than any presence we're equipped to prove. Story 4. The crosswalk signal glowed green against the November dusk when I stepped off the curb on Market Street. I remember the exact shade, that institutional green that looks sickly under sodium lights, because it's the last normal thing I can recall with absolute certainty. The sedan came from my left, a blur of dark metal that materialized like something conjured rather than driven. No screech of brakes, no warning. Just the sudden displacement of air and the smell of hot rubber as it missed my leg by inches. The heat from the engine washed over my calf like breath. I shouted something. The words don't matter. Just noise, really. The animal sound you make when death brushes past you. What matters is that the car stopped. Not gradually. It just stopped, as if the laws of momentum had taken a coffee break. Then it reversed with that high-pitched mechanical whine that makes your teeth hurt, curved around with unnatural precision, and pulled up beside me. The passenger window descended with the smooth, electric purr of something expensive. The man inside looked ordinary. That's what I told myself later anyway. Brown hair, average build, wearing a gray hoodie that could have come from any department store. But his eyes had this flatness to them, like painted on details in a photograph. And his voice, when he spoke, carried no inflection whatsoever. Already took lives for less than that, he said. Not threatened, not confessed, just stated it, the way you might mention the weather or the price of gas. Then the window rose, and he drove away at exactly the speed limit, his brake lights winking at me like red eyes in the gathering dark. I walked the remaining 4 blocks to my apartment, with my heart doing strange arrhythmic things in my chest. The streetlights seemed dimmer than usual, and I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that jerked to stillness when I turned my head. By the time I reached my building, sweat had glued my shirt to my spine despite the chill. Inside, I locked the door, checked it twice, then poured myself bourbon with hands that trembled enough to click the glass against the bottle's rim. I told myself it was adrenaline, that near-death experiences did this to everyone, that I'd laugh about it tomorrow over coffee. But even as I thought these things, some older part of my brain was screaming that I'd looked into a pair of eyes that had actually done what they'd claimed. The news came on at 11. I wasn't really watching, just needed the noise to fill my apartment, to crowd out the silence that had begun to feel like it was listening. But then the anchor mentioned Market Street, and I sat forward so fast the bourbon sloshed over my wrist. A fugitive, wanted in connection with armed robberies across 3 states. Last seen using stolen credit cards at a gas station on the outskirts of town. The security footage showed a man in a gray hoodie, driving a dark sedan. Same make and model. Same color. The anchor kept talking, but I couldn't hear the words anymore over the sound of my own pulse. He'd been right there, right next to me. Close enough that I could have reached through that window and touched him if I'd been stupid enough to try. I didn't sleep that night. Every car that passed on the street below made me check the window, parting the blinds just enough to see out without being seen. The building settled and creaked around me with the sounds old structures make, but each groan of wood and whisper of pipes beat doorknob. Morning brought no relief, just a gray light that made everything look washed out and unreal. I called in sick to work, a lie that felt like premonition. My boss sounded annoyed, and I almost told him about the encounter, about the fugitive. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the certainty in my gut that speaking about it would make it more real, would give it weight and substance it didn't need. I made coffee and burned my tongue on the first sip. The pain felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. Through the kitchen window, I could see the parking lot behind my building, and there, between a rusted pickup and a soccer mom's minivan, sat a dark sedan. My hands locked around the mug. It could be anyone's car. The complex had 120 units. Dark sedans weren't exactly rare, but I stood there for 10 minutes watching, waiting for movement. The vehicle sat motionless, its windshield a black mirror catching nothing. I stepped away from the window, returned a minute later, still there. The rest of the day passed in a fog. I tried to read, but the words slid off the page without meaning. Tried to eat, but my throat wouldn't cooperate. Mostly I found myself at that kitchen window, checking on the sedan which hadn't moved an inch. At 3 in the afternoon, a woman came out and got into it. A stranger in yoga pants and a ponytail. She drove away, and I laughed out loud at my own paranoia, a sound that echoed too loudly in my empty apartment. But the relief curdled quickly. Because if that car belonged to someone else, where was his? Night arrived too early. The sun set at 5:30, and by 6, The darkness outside my windows felt absolute. I kept the curtains drawn and every light in the apartment burning, which made the windows into black mirrors that showed me my own reflection moving through the rooms. Except sometimes the reflection seemed to move a fraction of a second before I did, and I'd catch myself mid-gesture, frozen, trying to determine if I'd moved first or the mirror had. I found myself checking the door lock obsessively, every 20 minutes, then every 10, then every time I passed it. The deadbolt was solid, the chain secure, but they began to feel insufficient. Anyone could kick down a door if they really wanted to. Any lock could be picked. Any chain could be cut. The phone rang at 9:47. I know the exact time because I was staring at the clock, watching the minutes crawl by, when the sound split the silence. I didn't recognize the number. I let it ring, 6 times, 7, then it stopped. 30 seconds later it rang again. Same number. My hand reached for it without conscious decision, some ingrained response to ringing phones that overrode my fear. I lifted it to my ear but didn't speak, breathing on the other end. Not heavy or theatrical, just the sound of air moving in and out of lungs. Then in that same flat voice, "You should have kept walking." The line went dead. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear until the disconnect tone started beeping. Then I set it down very carefully, as if sudden movement might trigger something. My apartment felt too bright now, too exposed. All those windows with their curtains drawn. He could be on the other side of any of them, looking at the thin fabric and knowing exactly where I stood. I turned off the lights one by one, moving through the rooms like I was diffusing bombs. In the darkness, I could see out better. The parking lot below was mostly empty, the few cars present belonging to neighbors I recognized. No dark sedan, no movement at all except the wind pushing trash across the pavement. But I could feel eyes on me. Not a metaphor, not paranoia, an actual physical sensation like heat on my skin. I dropped to the floor below the window line and crawled to my bedroom, my knees aching against the hardwood. In the closet, I found the baseball bat I'd bought 3 years ago during a minor crime wave in the neighborhood. I'd never used it. The price tag was still stuck to the barrel. I peeled it off and positioned myself in the corner of the living room where I had a clear view of the door but couldn't be seen from the windows. The night stretched. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. Every sound the building made, and there were dozens, might be him. The elevator whirring to life on another floor. Footsteps in the apartment above. Voices in the hallway that rose and fell and faded. Water running through pipes in the walls. And underneath it all, a new sound. Or maybe it had been there all along and I was only now noticing it. A soft scraping, rhythmic and patient. Like someone running their fingernails along the outside of my door. I held my breath and listened. There, just at the edge of hearing. Scritch. 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 I crept to the door, bat raised, put my eye to the peephole. The hallway beyond warped in the fisheye lens, empty except for the industrial carpet and the exit sign's red glow. Nothing moved, but the scraping continued. Then I realized the sound was coming from behind me. I spun around. The living room stretched away in shadows, illuminated only by the ambient city light filtering through the curtains. Nothing there. Nothing I could see. But the sound persisted, now seeming to come from the kitchen. Then the bedroom. Then right behind me again. I pressed my back against the door, bat clutched so hard my hands cramped. The scraping moved through the apartment like it was searching, methodical and patient. It found the windows, traced their frames, found the closet door, whispered along its edges, found the bathroom mirror, scratched at its surface from the inside. My phone rang again. This time I grabbed it immediately, desperate for connection to something outside this nightmare. Hello? Static. Then, buried in the white noise, a voice. His voice. Can you hear them too? Hear what? The words came out cracked. The things that follow us, the things we collect when we look into the wrong faces, make the wrong choices, survive the wrong moments. The line went dead again, but this time the silence felt inhabited. I lowered the phone and found myself staring at my reflection in its black screen. My face looked wrong, features slightly rearranged, like a photocopy of a photocopy. As I watched, the reflection smiled, though I hadn't moved my mouth. The scraping stopped. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat, and underneath it, another rhythm. Slower, heavier, like a second heart beating just slightly out of sync with my own. Morning came eventually, the way it always does, though I have no memory of the hours between 3 a.m. and dawn. I found myself still in the corner, bat across my knees, with no recollection of the night's passage. The apartment looked the same as always. Nothing disturbed, nothing moved. The door remained locked, the windows secure, but on the inside of my front door, at eye level, someone had carved words into the wood with something sharp. Fresh splinters curled from the gouges. You should have kept walking. I didn't call the police. Couldn't explain how someone had carved those words on the inside of a locked door without getting in. Couldn't explain the phone calls from a fugitive who should have been running, not stalking. Couldn't explain the sound that had moved through my apartment like something living. Instead, I packed a bag and left, drove to a motel 40 miles away, and paid cash for a room in the back. I told myself I'd stay there until they caught him, until the news reported his arrest and I could breathe again. But I've been here for 6 days now, and I'm starting to understand that distance doesn't matter. Last night I heard the scraping again, moving along the motel room walls. This morning, I found words carved into the bathroom mirror. Condensation from my shower had revealed them. The thing is, I've started to wonder if he was warning me or claiming me. If that moment on Market Street, when our eyes met through the car window, transferred something between us. Some mark or stain that can't be washed away. I can feel it now, always. That second heartbeat that isn't mine. That presence just behind my shoulder when I turn. The way my reflection moves a fraction of a second before I do. And sometimes, late at night when the world thins to nothing, I think about that flat voice on the phone, asking if I could hear them too. The things that follow, the things we collect. I'm starting to think I can. The TV in the corner has been playing news on mute for the past hour. I haven't looked at it, but I can see its glow in my peripheral vision, casting shadows that move wrong. Just now, something made me turn my head. The screen shows a breaking news banner. They found him, the fugitive, pulled from a river 3 counties over. The medical examiner says he's been dead for at least 10 days. 10 days. That would put his death 2 days before I crossed Market Street. I'm staring at the TV now, at the grainy security photo they're showing, and his eyes are looking directly at the camera with that same flat emptiness, looking at me through time and screens and death itself. My phone is ringing again. I know I shouldn't answer it. Know that whatever is on the other end isn't him, isn't human, isn't anything that should exist in the space between the living and wherever he went. But my hand is already reaching for it, because maybe the thing that's been following me wasn't his ghost or his curse. Maybe I've been following it all along. Maybe on that November evening I didn't almost get hit by a car. Maybe I did, and everything since has been the space between impact and darkness, stretched and distorted like a scream that never ends. The phone is in my hand now. I can feel that second heartbeat pounding. The scraping has started again, but this time it's not coming from outside. It's coming from inside my chest. I'm going to answer the phone now. I'm going to lift it to my ear and listen to whatever speaks from the other end, because I need to know if the voice I hear will be his or mine, and which answer would be worse. The screen glows green in my palm. That same sickly institutional green as the crosswalk signal. The same color as the last normal thing I remember, before I learned what it means to take a life, or lose one, or live in the terrible space where both things happen at once, forever, in an eternal November dusk, where the lights are always wrong and nothing ever really ends. I'm answering now. Hello? Story 5. The voice came through crystal clear, almost too clear for a fast food intercom. Professional. Warm. It repeated my order back to me. Double cheeseburger, fries, cola, without a single error, without the usual static crackle that accompanies these transactions. Then it asked me to pull forward to the first window. I'd been driving through Nevada for 6 hours, my eyes burning from the desert sun that turned the highway into a river of mercury. Reno appeared like a mirage, all neon and promise, and this burger joint sat right off the exit ramp, its sign spinning lazily in the afternoon heat. My stomach had been growling since Winnemucca. The drive-through lane curved around the building, painted lines faded but still visible. 3 cars ahead of me, all idling. Normal lunch rush. Through my windshield, I could see the bright interior of the restaurant, fluorescent lights humming behind large windows. Everything looked operational, inviting even. The smell of fryer oil hung heavy in the air, mixing with exhaust fumes and hot asphalt. I pulled up to the first window. It remained closed. Through the glass, I could see the computer monitor glowing blue, displaying what looked like order screens. A headset hung on a hook beside it. The register drawer sat partially open, bills visible inside, but no person, no movement. I waited. 30 seconds became a minute. The car behind me honked, short, impatient. I held up my hand in apology and leaned toward my passenger window, trying to peer deeper into the restaurant. The kitchen stretched beyond the counter, stainless steel surfaces gleaming under harsh lights. I could see the grill, spots of grease catching the light. The fryers appeared to be on, oil shimmering in their basins. Steam rose from somewhere I couldn't quite see. Another honk. Longer this time. I pulled forward to the second window, assuming some confusion about which window handled what. Maybe they'd changed their system. Maybe the first window was broken. Reasonable explanations crowded my mind, each one slightly less convincing than the last. The second window was also closed, also empty, but here I had a better view of the interior. The restaurant stretched before me like a stage set, tables clean and ready, menu boards lit and displaying specials, a drink machine with cups stacked beside it. Everything in its place, waiting, always waiting. No people. The car behind me pulled up, honked again, then swung around me and approached the pickup window. I watched in my side mirror as the driver, a woman in a white sedan, gestured animatedly at the window, her mouth moving in what I assumed were increasingly frustrated demands. After a moment, she too pulled away, tires squealing slightly as she accelerated back onto the street. I should have followed her. That's what any sensible person would have done. But hunger does strange things to decision-making, and beneath that hunger sat something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the first stirrings of something I didn't yet recognize. I parked in the lot and approached the front entrance. The door was locked. Through the glass, the restaurant looked even more surreal from this angle. A perfectly preserved moment of operation with the operators removed. The counter stood ready to take orders. Behind it, bags and boxes waited to be filled. Everything suggested imminence, that at any second someone would appear from the back, apologizing for the delay, offering free fries for the inconvenience. No one came. I cupped my hands against the glass, pressing my face close. The kitchen area revealed more details from this vantage. I could see a prep station with vegetables partially chopped, a knife lying beside them. Not thrown down in panic, but placed there with intention, as if the person using it had simply paused mid-task and walked away. A timer blinked on one of the cooking surfaces, counting down from 3 minutes. For what? To alert whom? The fluorescent lights created shadows that seemed too deep, too solid. They pooled in corners and beneath equipment with an unusual density. I found myself watching those shadows, waiting for them to move. They didn't, but the expectation remained, a tension in my chest that grew with each passing moment. I walked around the building. The drive-through menu board still displayed items and prices, its speaker grill staring at me like a mechanical eye. The air conditioning units hummed on the roof. Power flowed. Systems operated. Only the human element had been extracted, leaving everything else to continue its automated routines. The back door was also locked. But here I found something else. A cigarette, recently crushed, still trailing a thin line of smoke from where someone had ground it under their heel. The ember hadn't completely died. Minutes old, maybe. Less than 10, certainly. Someone had been here, had stepped outside for a break, had finished their smoke, and then... what? Walked away? Disappeared? I picked up the cigarette butt without thinking. Evidence of something I couldn't yet articulate. It was still warm. The parking lot held 4 cars besides mine. I checked each one, peering through windows, looking for clues. An SUV contained a child's car seat and scattered toys. A pickup truck had construction materials in the bed. A sedan looked like it belonged to someone's grandmother, complete with handicap placard and boxes of tissues on the dash. The fourth was a compact covered in bumper stickers. Normal vehicles, daily drivers, cars that suggested their owners had merely stepped inside for lunch and would return momentarily. But they wouldn't return. Somehow I knew this, the knowledge settling into my bones like cold water. I returned to my car and waited. Maybe this was a drill. Maybe there'd been a gas leak, an evacuation I'd somehow missed. Emergency services would arrive soon with explanations and apologies. The rational part of my brain constructed scenarios, each one testifying to mundane causes and logical conclusions. An hour passed. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening. The timer in the kitchen would have gone off by now. Whatever it had been monitoring would have burned or overcooked. The fryers continued heating oil for food that would never be cooked. The computer screens maintained their vigil, waiting for orders to be entered by hands that didn't exist. 2 more cars pulled into the drive-thru during that hour. Both went through the same sequence I had, ordering at the speaker, pulling forward, waiting, confusion, eventual departure. One driver got out and tried the front door as I had. He was younger than me, maybe early 20s, with the aggressive confidence of someone who believed strongly in his right to service. I watched him pound on the glass, cup his hands to look inside, pound again with more force. His anger dissolved into unease remarkably quickly. He returned to his car and sat there for several minutes, staring at the building, before finally leaving. I should have left then too. Should have driven back to the highway, found another restaurant, continued my journey. Instead, I walked to the drive-thru speaker. The menu board hummed its electric hum. I stood before the speaker grill, that dark mesh behind which the voice had come earlier. Now it was silent. I said hello. No response. I said it again, louder. Nothing. Then, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself, I placed an order, different from before: chicken sandwich, onion rings, Sprite. I spoke clearly, the way you do when talking to voice recognition software, enunciating each word. Silence. Long enough that I began to turn away. Then the voice returned. The same voice. Pleasant. Professional. It repeated my order back to me perfectly, asked me to pull forward to the first window, and went silent again. My hands were shaking as I returned to my car. I'd expected the silence. The voice emerging from it felt like a violation of natural law, like hearing a corpse speak. But worse than that was the recognition that flooded through me. I knew that voice. Not personally, but structurally. I'd heard it before, in countless drive-thrus across countless cities. It was the voice of customer service, of scripted interactions, of transaction efficiency. It was everyone's voice and no one's voice. I didn't pull forward. I sat in my car, door locked, windows up despite the heat, and stared at the building. The afternoon light gave it an almost beautiful quality, the kind of nostalgic Americana that photographers love. Bright colors, clean lines, promises of simple satisfaction. But there was something performative about it now, as if the building had become aware of itself, conscious of its role and determined to play it perfectly, even in the absence of any audience. The sun sank lower. Long shadows stretched across the parking lot. I realized I'd been sitting there for over 3 hours. My phone had no signal, which seemed wrong for the middle of a city, but I'd stopped questioning what seemed wrong. Everything seemed wrong. The question had become what, if anything, remained right. That's when I noticed the lights inside were changing, not dimming exactly, but shifting in quality. The fluorescence appeared to pulse, a rhythm so subtle I almost missed it. Once I noticed, I couldn't unsee it. The entire interior seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in some vast, slow respiration. The shadows I'd watched earlier were definitely moving now, though not in any direction I could track. They flowed rather than crept, like spilled ink across a tilted surface. A new car entered the drive-through. I wanted to warn them, to wave them away, but I remained frozen. The driver ordered. The voice responded, repeated the order, asked them to pull forward. The car advanced to the first window, waited, then the second window, waited longer. Finally, the driver got out and approached the front door. But this time something was different. I could see them through the glass doors, pressing against it, trying the handle. Then they stopped. Their posture changed, their head tilted as if listening to something. They remained there, motionless, for almost a minute. When they finally turned away and walked back to their car, their movements had a strange quality, too smooth, too purposeful. They didn't display the confusion or frustration I'd seen in the other drivers. They got in their vehicle and drove away with what looked like complete calm. Night was falling now. The parking lot lights flickered on, their yellow sodium glow creating new territories of shadow. The restaurant's interior grew brighter by contrast, a beacon of light and emptiness. I could see everything inside with perfect clarity. The kitchen, the counter, the tables, all of it pristine and waiting. I decided to leave. Finally, after hours of irrational paralysis, survival instinct kicked in. I turned my key in the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, then died. I tried again. Same result. The dashboard lights glowed, suggesting the battery held charge, but the engine refused to catch. Of course it wouldn't start. Some part of me had known it wouldn't. The same part that had kept me here watching, waiting, knowing that I was meant to stay until something revealed itself, or until I became part of whatever this place was. I looked up to find someone standing at my driver's window. He wore a uniform, the restaurant's uniform, polyester and name tag and everything regulation. His face was ordinary in a way that made it hard to remember even as I looked directly at it. Features that could have belonged to anyone, assembled in a configuration that seemed right but somehow wasn't. He smiled at me through the glass, a perfect customer service smile. He gestured toward the building, an invitation. I shook my head. He nodded, understanding, and gestured again, more insistent now. Behind him, I could see others emerging from the restaurant's front door, which stood open though I'd never seen it unlock. They wore the same uniforms. They moved with the same purposeful smoothness. They were all smiling. My door locks popped up, all four of them simultaneously. I reached for them, pushed them back down. They popped up again immediately. I tried holding my driver's door lock down, pressing it with physical force. It pushed back against my hand, a steady mechanical pressure that grew stronger until my thumb ached, and I had to release it. The door opened. The employee stepped back to give me room. His smile never wavered. I got out. Not because I wanted to, but because the alternative, staying in the car while those locks continued their automated rebellion, seemed worse. The night air hit me, cooler than I expected, carrying that fryer smell stronger than ever. Beneath it, something else. Electrical, like ozone before a storm. They formed a path for me, these smiling employees, leading toward the open front door. I walked between them because moving forward seemed marginally better than turning around. Their uniforms rustled as I passed. None of them spoke. Their name tags were blank. The interior was exactly as I'd seen it through the windows. Bright, clean, ready, but the air inside held a different quality than outside. Thicker somehow, resistant. Each breath required conscious effort, as if I were learning to breathe all over again. The timer I'd seen earlier had reset itself. It counted down from 10 minutes now. For what purpose, I couldn't guess. The partially chopped vegetables remained on the prep station, unchanged from hours ago. Time seemed negotiable here, proceeding at rates determined by rules I didn't understand. One of the employees gestured toward the counter. I approached it. Behind the register, another employee appeared, though I hadn't seen them arrive. This one was different. Older, or at least older seeming, with that indefinable quality of authority. A manager, perhaps. They looked at me expectantly. I realized they wanted me to order. Despite everything, despite the wrongness radiating from every surface, they wanted me to participate in the transaction. So I did. I gave them the order I'd placed at the speaker hours ago. They nodded, entered it into the computer with practiced efficiency. The screen glowed brighter as they worked, casting their face in stark blue light that made their features seem to shift and rearrange. They told me my total, $12.73. I paid. They gave me exact change, each coin and bill placed carefully in my palm. Their hand was cold. Not cold like coming in from winter, but cold like something that had never been warm. Cold like metal, like plastic, like the surfaces that surrounded us. My order number was called almost immediately. Someone handed me a bag, the paper warm in my hands, grease already staining its bottom. A cup of cola sat beside it, ice crackling as it settled. Real food, real drink, everything perfect, everything as ordered. I stood there holding my meal, surrounded by smiling employees in their clean uniforms, under fluorescent lights that pulsed their slow-breathing rhythm. They waited for something, for me to leave perhaps, or to stay, or to become. The front door was still open. I could see my car through it, sitting in the yellow parking lot light. Freedom was 20 feet away, but as I looked at the door it seemed to stretch, the distance expanding even as I watched. Or maybe I was the one stretching, elongating, becoming something that could accommodate this space and its rules. I sat down at one of the tables instead, opened my bag. The burger was exactly as I'd ordered it. The fries were hot, perfectly salted. The cola was cold and sweet. I ate slowly, aware of the employees watching me. Not staring, but maintaining that professional attentiveness that good service requires. Ready to assist if needed. Always ready. When I finished, I stood to leave. The employees moved aside again, reforming their path. I walked toward the door. It was the proper distance now, no longer stretched. Normal space, normal geometry. I was almost there when I heard my name called. Not shouted, but announced over the speaker system, the way they call out order numbers. I turned. One of the employees held up a name tag. They'd made it while I ate, my name printed clearly across white plastic. They extended it toward me, still smiling. I took it. The clip felt natural in my hand. I could pin it to my shirt, become part of this perfect, empty, endlessly operational space. Join the rotation, taking orders, preparing food, maintaining the fiction of service that continues whether anyone is served or not. The name tag was heavy, heavier than plastic and paper should be. I held it, feeling its weight, while the employees waited for my decision. Outside, dawn was breaking. I'd been inside all night, though it had felt like minutes. Through the windows, I could see cars beginning to fill the drive-through lane. Morning rush. People on their way to work, wanting coffee and breakfast sandwiches, wanting that familiar transaction that marks the beginning of another day. The speaker system crackled to life. Orders came through one after another. The voice that took them was pleasant, professional, mine and not mine. Everyone's voice and no one's voice. I'm still here. The name tag is clipped to my shirt. I take orders, prepare food, maintain standards. My coworkers smile their perfect smiles, and I smile back. We work our shifts, though the shifts never really end. Time moves differently here, or maybe it doesn't move at all. Maybe we've found the still point, the moment between asking and receiving, and we've decided to live there. Sometimes I see people through the windows, cupping their hands against the glass, looking confused or afraid. I want to wave, to warn them, but my hands are busy with orders. There's always another order. The voice keeps taking them. My voice, our voice, the voice of the place itself. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, I think about walking through that front door, getting in my car, driving away. But then I remember that my car wouldn't start, that the locks wouldn't stay down, that I'd already made my choice the moment I'd accepted the order, paid my $12.73, consumed what was offered. You can't leave after you've eaten. That's not how it works. Once you participate, once you complete the transaction, you become part of the system. Another smiling face behind the counter, another voice taking orders, another set of hands preparing food that will trap the next person who thinks hunger is the worst thing they can experience. I wonder sometimes if anyone will find this place strange, if they'll notice the same employees working every shift, never aging, never complaining, if they'll question why the restaurant never closes, why it's always bright and clean and ready. But people don't question these things. They want their food fast and their service efficient. We provide both. We're very good at what we do. The timer just beeped. Something needs to be rotated in the fryer. My manager is looking at me expectantly. There's a car at the drive-through speaker waiting to order. The day continues its endless cycle. I should get back to work. We pride ourselves on speed and accuracy. Customer satisfaction is our primary goal. After all, someone has to take the orders. Someone has to keep the lights on. Someone has to smile. Story 6. The strobing blue light filled my rearview mirror like a diseased pulse, painting the interior of my sedan in rhythmic waves of cold illumination. I'd been driving Route 537 for the better part of an hour, the kind of secondary road that serpentines through the pine barrens with such monotonous consistency that the trees begin to look like the same tree, repeated endlessly in a loop of shadow and bark. It was past midnight. The highway would have been faster, but I'd convinced myself the scenic route would clear my head after the conference. 3 days of forced networking in fluorescent-lit convention halls had left me feeling hollowed out, desperately craving the silence of my apartment and the familiar weight of my own thoughts. The blue light insisted. I slowed, checking my speedometer, 42 in a 50 zone. My inspection sticker was current, registration valid. The rational part of my brain cataloged these facts while something deeper, more primitive, began sending distress signals I couldn't quite articulate. I pulled onto the shoulder where the pines pressed close enough to scrape the passenger side with their lowest branches. The patrol car, if that's what it was, stopped about 15 feet behind me, its single light bar still cycling through that hypnotic blue. No red, just blue, 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 like a vein cut open and pulsing. In my side mirror, I watched a figure emerge from the vehicle. The silhouette was wrong somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Too tall, maybe, or moving with a cadence that didn't match the confident stride I'd come to expect from officers during the handful of traffic stops I'd experienced in my 36 years. This person moved like someone learning to walk, each step deliberate and slightly uncertain. The knock on my window made me flinch. I'd been so focused on the mirror that I'd lost track of the approach. Through the glass, I could make out a uniform, dark fabric, the suggestion of badges and patches. But the face remained obscured by the angle of a flashlight aimed directly at my eyes. I lowered the window 3 inches. The voice that emerged was pleasant enough, neutral and professional, asking for my license and registration. I handed them through the gap, my fingers trembling slightly from the adrenaline my body had decided to release into my bloodstream. The logical part of my mind kept insisting this was routine, that my anxiety was a product of exhaustion and too much coffee, and the inherent unease of being alone on a dark road. The flashlight lowered slightly, and I got my first clear look at the face above the uniform. Male, probably in his 40s, with features so unremarkably average, they seemed almost designed to be forgotten. Pale skin, thin lips, eyes that reflected the flashlight's beam in a way that made me think of animals on highways at night. That flat shine that registers as fundamentally other. He studied my documents for longer than seemed necessary, tilting his head as he read, and I noticed his lips moving slightly, as if he were sounding out the words. The flashlight in his other hand never stopped moving, tracing small circles that made the shadows dance and twist inside my car. When he finally spoke again, the questions came rapid fire, but without the practiced efficiency of someone who'd asked them 1,000 times before. Where was I coming from? Where was I headed? Did I live alone? Was anyone expecting me? The last 2 questions landed differently than the others, carrying a weight that made the hair on my forearms stand at attention. I answered carefully, measuring each word. Conference in Princeton. Headed home to Trenton. The living situation question I deflected with vague assurances about my destination. And I definitely didn't mention that my apartment would be empty. That I'd be alone there for at least the next 18 hours before my roommate returned from visiting his parents upstate. The officer, if that's what he was, leaned closer to my partially opened window. His breath fogged the glass, and I caught a smell that was difficult to place. Not unpleasant exactly, but organic and strange, like rain-soaked earth or the inside of a greenhouse. He asked if I had any tools in the vehicle, weapons, anything sharp. The specificity of the question sent ice water through my veins. This wasn't protocol. This was someone gathering information for purposes I couldn't fathom, but that my body was absolutely convinced were hostile. I told him I didn't understand the relevance of the question. My voice came out steadier than I felt, and I saw something flicker across his face. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. The pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, and beneath it I glimpsed something that looked almost predatory, focused and utterly cold. His tone changed immediately, the professional veneer cracking to reveal sharp edges underneath. He told me to step out of the vehicle, the words coming out clipped and hard, and his hand moved toward his belt in a gesture that could have been reaching for handcuffs or something else entirely. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed in unison. I hit the lock button on my door panel and watched all 4 locks engage with small metallic thunks that sounded absurdly loud in the confined space. Through the window, I saw his expression shift again, this time settling into something that looked almost pleased, as if I'd done exactly what he'd expected. He told me again to exit the vehicle, his voice now devoid of any pretense at authority. It was flat and strange, like someone reading from a script they didn't quite understand. He raised his other hand, and I saw he was holding something that might have been a radio but looked too bulky, too angular. He brought it toward his mouth but didn't seem to speak into it, just held it there like a prop in a play he was performing for an audience of one. My phone was in the center console. I grabbed it with hands that no longer felt like mine, each finger moving independently and clumsily, as if I were wearing thick gloves. The screen's light felt like a lifeline as I dialed 911, my thumb leaving a smear of sweat across the glass. The operator's voice was crisp and real, in a way that made everything else feel like a fever dream. I explained the situation in a rush of words, giving my location as precisely as I could manage. Route 537, about 8 miles past the intersection with County Road 526, pulled over on the shoulder with what I was now quite certain was not an actual police officer standing beside my window. The operator asked me to describe the vehicle behind me. I angled my rearview mirror and felt something fundamental shift in my chest. The car was there, its shape just visible in the ambient moonlight, but it was wrong. The proportions were off. The light bar on top looked improvised, like something cobbled together from hardware store components, and the blue light itself, now that I was really paying attention, seemed to be coming from multiple small sources rather than a single professional unit, giving it a scattered, discontinuous quality. The operator told me there were no state police units in that area, no local patrol cars, no legitimate traffic stops in progress anywhere along that stretch of road. She instructed me to stay in my vehicle with doors locked and told me officers were being dispatched from the nearest barracks, but it would be at least 15 minutes before they could reach my location. 15 minutes. The number seemed both infinite and impossibly short. I kept the phone on speaker and watched the figure outside my window. He hadn't moved since I'd locked the doors, just stood there with that bulky, not quite radio in one hand, and the flashlight still tracing its endless circles with the other. His head was tilted at an angle that suggested he was listening to something, but his eyes never left my face. The operator kept talking, her voice a steady stream of reassurance and procedure, engaged and alert, but I could barely process her words. The figure had retrieved something from his vehicle, something he cradled against his chest as he turned back toward my car. The flashlight beam caught it briefly, and I saw what looked like a large thermos or canister, featureless and dark. He approached my window again, moving faster now, with more purpose. The pleasant expression was completely gone, replaced by something I can only describe as focused intention. He raised the canister, and I saw his thumb move toward what might have been a button or valve on its top. I put the car in drive and stomped on the accelerator. The sedan's tires spun against loose gravel for a heart-stopping moment before finding purchase, and then I was moving, accelerating up the shoulder and back onto the pavement. In my rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing motionless in the cone of dust my departure had kicked up, his free hand raised as if in farewell or perhaps warning. The blue light behind him strobed once, twice, 3 times, then went dark. The operator was shouting through the phone speaker, asking if I was okay, telling me to drive toward the responding units. I confirmed I was moving, heading west on 537 toward civilization and light and other people. The trees blurred past on either side, their trunks catching my headlights in stuttering sequence. It took 3 miles before I allowed myself to check the mirror again. The road behind me was empty, showing nothing but my own taillights painting the asphalt red. No pursuit, no blue light, nothing but the endless corridor of pines and the white line disappearing into darkness. I drove until I saw the flashing lights of actual police cars approaching from the opposite direction, their red and blue patterns reassuringly correct and official. I pulled over in a turnout near a closed gas station and waited for them with my hands visible on the steering wheel, and every light in my car turned on. The officers who questioned me were professional and thorough, taking down my description and the location of the encounter. They radioed for units to sweep the area while one of them examined my vehicle, walking around it slowly with his flashlight, occasionally crouching to check underneath. He spent a long time at the driver's side rear tire, studying something I couldn't see from my position in the passenger seat of their cruiser. When he returned, his expression was carefully neutral in a way that made my stomach drop. He asked if I'd noticed anyone tampering with my car before the traffic stop. I told him no, that I'd driven straight from the convention center's parking garage to the highway to this road, with no stops in between. He showed me a photograph on his phone. The image was dim and slightly out of focus, but I could make out what looked like a small electronic device attached to my car's undercarriage just behind the rear wheel well. He explained it was a GPS tracker, consumer grade but effective, the kind you could order online with no questions asked. They removed it and bagged it as evidence, though the officer's tone suggested they wouldn't find anything useful from it. These devices were disposable and essentially untraceable, he said. Someone had been following my movements, probably for at least a day, maybe longer. Long enough to know my route. Long enough to pick the perfect spot for an interception on a road with no houses, no businesses, no witnesses. The sweep of the area where I'd been stopped found nothing. No vehicle. No footprints beyond my own tire tracks. No evidence anyone had been there at all except for the testimony of a tired conference attendee with a wild story and a GPS tracker that proved at least part of his paranoia was justified. They escorted me home, following my car all the way to my apartment building in Trenton. The officers did a walkthrough of my place before leaving, checking closets and windows with methodical efficiency. They gave me case numbers and contact information, assurances about increased patrols, suggestions about security systems and awareness. After they left, I sat in my living room with all the lights on and tried to convince myself I was safe. The tracker had been removed. The police were aware. Whatever that person had been planning, I'd escaped it through luck and instinct and a 911 operator's steady voice. But as the adrenaline faded and exhaustion crept in, other details began surfacing in my memory. Small things I'd been too panicked to consciously register in the moment. The way the figure's uniform had seemed slightly too large, as if worn over bulky layers or perhaps something that wasn't quite human-shaped. The fact that his breath had fogged my window despite the night being unseasonably warm for October in New Jersey. The realization that in all the time he'd stood at my window, I'd never actually seen him blink. I pulled up the GPS tracking app on my phone, the one that had been logging my location data for months as part of some half-forgotten photo organization feature. The timeline showed my movements for the past 72 hours in meticulous detail. Convention Center, highway, Route 537. But when I zoomed in on the stretch of road where the encounter had occurred, there was a gap in the data. A perfect blank space lasting exactly 12 minutes, as if I'd simply ceased to exist during that time. Or perhaps as if something had very deliberately edited that portion of my journey from existence. I'm writing this 3 days later, sitting in my apartment with every door locked, and a chair wedged under the handle of the front door, in addition to the deadbolt. My roommate returned yesterday, and I haven't told him anything beyond vague mentions of a weird encounter with a fake cop. He's concerned about my paranoia, the way I check the windows compulsively, my insistence on keeping all the blinds closed even during the day. What I haven't told him, what I haven't told anyone, is about the envelope that was waiting in my mailbox this morning. Plain white, no return address, no postage mark suggesting it had gone through the actual postal system. Just my name printed in block letters across the front. Inside was a photograph taken from behind my car on Route 537. The angle was wrong for a dashboard camera, positioned too high and slightly to the left. The timestamp in the corner showed the exact date and time of my encounter with the blue light. And in the bottom right of the frame, barely visible against the darkness of the pines, was something that might have been a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. Watching. Waiting. There was nothing else in the envelope. No note. No demands. No explanation. Just that single image suggesting that whatever happened on that road, whatever that person wanted from me, the encounter might not be finished after all. I've stopped using Route 537. I've stopped using secondary roads entirely. I take highways now, even though they add time to every journey. Staying in the brightest lanes surrounded by other vehicles, I almost succeed. But then I notice other details in the image, small things that shouldn't be possible. The way my car's taillights seem to leave trails in the air behind them, as if the photograph captured not a single instant but several moments compressed together. The fact that my silhouette is visible through the rear window, head turned at an angle that suggests I was looking not toward the front of my car where the blue light should have been, but to the side, into the trees, at something the photograph doesn't show. I've started sleeping with the lights on. I've started checking the rear view mirror constantly even when I'm not driving. A compulsive gesture that my hands complete without conscious thought. I've started seeing blue flashing lights in my peripheral vision, though they're never there when I turn to look directly. My roommate thinks I should talk to someone. He's probably right. But how do you explain to a therapist that you're haunted not by what happened, but by the growing certainty that whatever happened wasn't the whole story? That somewhere in your memory there's a gap you can't access, a blank space filled with something your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge? The photograph sits in my desk drawer now, hidden beneath insurance papers and old tax returns. I don't look at it anymore, but I'm aware of it constantly, its presence a weight that never diminishes. Sometimes late at night I imagine I can hear it down there in the darkness, not making sound exactly, but somehow generating a quality of attention, as if it's watching me through layers of wood and paper, waiting patiently for something I can't name. Route 537 is still there, still winding through the pine barrens like a ribbon through an endless spool of trees. Other people drive it every night, alone and oblivious, their headlights cutting through the darkness before being swallowed again by the patient shadows. And somewhere along that road, maybe at the exact spot where I was pulled over, maybe somewhere else entirely, there's a figure in an ill-fitting uniform with a flashlight and a canister, and a blue light that pulses like a diseased heart. Waiting for the next driver who takes the scenic route. Waiting for someone who won't lock their doors quite fast enough. Waiting with the patience of something that has all the time in the world and nowhere else it needs to be. I tell myself I escaped. I tell myself the police response prevented whatever was planned. I tell myself the photograph is just a final attempt at intimidation, a calling card left by someone who got away. But sometimes in the absolute still of 3 a.m., I lie awake and wonder if the encounter on Route 537 ever really ended at all, or if some part of me is still sitting in that car on that dark shoulder, watching a figure approach with something terrible called barely functional. He'd catch me in the hallway, usually around 9 or 10 at night when I was coming back from the corner store, and he'd lean against his door frame with that particular intensity he had, telling me about the orange flickers he kept seeing in the corners of his apartment. Not like reflections, he'd insist, his voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper he used. These are in the corners themselves, like the angles are burning from the inside out. I'd nod, make some joke about checking his carbon monoxide detector, and continue to my own place 2 floors up. Daniel was harmless, just one of those people who saw patterns in randomness, meaning in coincidence. We'd all lived in the building long enough to know its quirks. The pipes that screamed at 3 in the morning, the way the elevator lurched between the second and third floors, the persistent smell of something cooking that no one could quite identify. Old buildings had personalities. Daniel's flames were just another eccentricity to add to the list. That changed on a Thursday in late September. I came home around midnight to find 3 fire trucks parked outside, their lights painting the brick facade in rotating shades of emergency. The crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk had that particular quality of excitement, mixed with concern that neighborhood disasters always produce. I pushed through, my stomach already tightening with the knowledge of what I'd find. Daniel's apartment was on the first floor, and even from the street, I could see the damage. Not flames, thank God, but smoke. Thick black smoke that had turned his windows into dark mirrors. The firefighters were already packing up, which meant whatever had happened was over, contained, dealt with. I found our building super, a man named Rodriguez who'd been managing the property for 15 years, standing near the entrance with his arms crossed over his chest. Electrical fire, he said before I could ask. In the walls. Been smoldering for God knows how long. He shook his head, and I could see genuine distress in his expression. Could have taken out the whole building. We got lucky. Daniel got lucky. But when I looked at Daniel, sitting in the back of an ambulance with a blanket around his shoulders, lucky wasn't the word that came to mind. His face had gone beyond pale into something almost translucent, and his eyes held a quality I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but something deeper and more fundamental. Recognition, maybe. Or vindication. I tried to catch his eye, but he was staring at nothing. His lips moving slightly as if he was counting or praying or simply trying to hold himself together through repetition. The family moved out within a week. The speed was remarkable, almost suspicious. One day the apartment was being aired out and assessed for damage. Daniel's unit and checked every other apartment. They found some outdated systems, sure, but nothing immediately dangerous. Nothing that would explain the intensity of Daniel's fear or his family's rapid departure. 2 months later, the landlord listed Daniel's apartment at a rate so low it might as well have been a confession. I saw the listing online. Charming first-floor unit, recently renovated, utilities included. The rent was 40% below market rate. When I mentioned it to Rodriguez, he just shrugged and said something about attracting tenants quickly, but his eyes didn't meet mine. No one took it for 3 months. I'd watch people go in for viewings, and they'd come out 20 minutes later with neutral expressions and polite excuses. The apartment was fine, they'd say, just not quite what they were looking for. Something about the light, or the layout, or the proximity to the street. Never anything concrete, but no one signed a lease. I started thinking about the flames more than I wanted to admit. Not during the day, when rational explanations held firm, but at night, when the building settled into its particular rhythm of creaks and whispers. I'd lie in bed and think about what Daniel had said, about corners burning from the inside out, about how an electrical fire could smolder in the walls for weeks, months even, producing heat and light that might be visible if you knew where to look, if your eyes had adjusted to seeing things that were technically there, but not quite manifest. The building started feeling different after that. Not immediately, but gradually, the way a relationship changes after a single honest conversation. I became aware of the angles in my own apartment, the corners where walls met ceiling, where floor met wall, where the shadows collected even when the lights were on. I'd catch myself staring at them longer than necessary, waiting for something I couldn't name. It was probably around Christmas when I first noticed the smell. Faint, acrid, like burning insulation or melting plastic. I'd wake up with it in my nostrils, sharp enough to pull me from sleep, but gone by the time I'd fully oriented myself. I checked everything. The outlets, the light fixtures, the space behind the refrigerator where dust collected in gray drifts. Nothing. Rodriguez sent an electrician who spent 2 hours checking my wiring and declared everything perfectly safe, even newer than he'd expected for a building this age. "You're probably smelling something from outside," he suggested, coiling his tester back into his toolbox. "Or maybe it's psychosomatic. People smell smoke after incidents like the one downstairs. It's normal." But it wasn't normal, and it wasn't psychosomatic. because I'd wake up with the taste of it in my mouth, metallic and wrong, like licking a battery. The new tenant moved into Daniel's apartment in January. A young professional, someone who worked in finance and was rarely home. I saw him once or twice in the hallway, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and the building's unreliable heating. He seemed fine, normal, unbothered by whatever presence or absence filled that first-floor unit. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made everything worse, because now I had to contend with the possibility that Daniel had been right, and this new tenant simply couldn't see what Daniel had seen. Or that I stopped laughing at Daniel's flames. In fact, I found myself wishing I'd listened more carefully when he'd tried to explain them to me. Had they always appeared in the same corners? Did they move? Did they respond to his attention or ignoring them? These seemed like important questions now, crucial data I'd dismissed as the ravings of an overactive imagination. February brought a cold snap that stressed the building's ancient heating system. Rodriguez warned everyone to use space heaters carefully, to check cords for fraying, to avoid overloading outlets. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we were, deliberately introducing more electrical load into a structure that had nearly burned from hidden wiring issues just months ago. I bought a space heater anyway. Everyone did. The building's radiators were insufficient against the sustained below-zero temperatures, and the choice was between mild fire risk and definite hypothermia. I placed mine in the corner of my bedroom, as far from the bed as possible, and I watched it more than I used it. The heating element would glow orange when it was on, and I'd lie in bed studying that artificial flame, wondering if this was what Daniel had seen, some manifestation of heat and electricity that shouldn't have been visible but was. The insomnia worsened. I'd manage an hour or two of sleep before jolting awake with the certainty that something was wrong, that I needed to check, that the corners were doing something they shouldn't be doing. I'd find myself standing in my living room at 4 a.m, staring at the junction where the north wall met the ceiling, convinced I could see a faint shimmer there, like heat distortion above summer asphalt. But it was February, and my apartment was cold enough that I could see my breath. I ran into Rodriguez in the lobby on one of those sleepless nights. It was past 3, and I'd given up on lying in bed, opting instead to take a walk around the building, checking door seals and window frames with the kind of purposeless purpose that insomnia provides. He was coming in from outside, his coat dusted with snow, and he looked almost as tired as I felt. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. And there was something in his voice that made me stop and really look at him. The lines around his eyes had deepened since September. He'd lost weight, and he had that same quality I'd seen in Daniel's face that night in the ambulance. Recognition, or resignation, or some combination of both. "The building feels different," I said, and I was surprised by how easily the words came, how little I cared about sounding irrational. Since the fire, since Daniel left. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear the building around us. The hum I'd become so familiar with, the pipes, the settling sounds that might have been foundation shifts, or might have been something else. Finally, he sighed and gestured toward the stairs leading down to the basement, where his office was located. "Let me show you something," he said. I followed him down, our footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell. The basement always had a particular quality, cooler than the rest of the building, with a dampness that suggested proximity to underground water despite the city's assurances that the water table was much deeper. Rodriguez's office was a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and maintenance equipment, but he led me past it to a door I'd never noticed before, painted the same industrial gray as the walls, and easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. "Original electrical room," he explained, producing a key from the ring at his belt. "Building inspector made me keep it locked after they rewired everything. Said it was a safety hazard, all those old systems still in place even though they're not connected to anything anymore." The room beyond the door was smaller than I expected, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, and it was filled with what looked like the skeleton of the building's original electrical system. Old ceramic insulators, cloth-wrapped wiring, fuse boxes with handwritten labels from decades ago. But what caught my attention, what made my breath catch in my throat, were the corners. In each corner of that small room, the junction where walls met ceiling, there was a discoloration. Not obvious, nothing you'd notice if you weren't looking for it. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The paint was darker there, almost charred, and the pattern suggested heat, sustained heat, over a long period of time. "They've always been like that," Rodriguez said quietly. I asked about it during the inspection after Daniel's incident. They said it was probably from the old wiring, heat buildup from decades of use. But those systems haven't been active for 40 years. He moved closer to one of the corners, not touching it, but getting close enough that I felt nervous. "Sometimes late at night when I'm doing rounds I come down here, and sometimes I think I can see them. Not flames, exactly, but something. A shimmer, like the air is burning." I wanted to ask him why he stayed, why he didn't just leave, find another building to manage. But I knew the answer already. It was the same reason I hadn't moved, why I'd dismissed Daniel's warnings until it was too late to benefit from them. Because acknowledging that something was fundamentally wrong with this place meant acknowledging that we'd all been in danger, that we'd all ignored signs we should have heeded, and that leaving wouldn't necessarily free us from whatever we'd already been exposed to. We stood there in that cramped electrical room for what might have been 5 minutes or 30. Time felt different down there, elastic and unreliable. I found myself staring at the corners, waiting for that shimmer, that confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind, that Daniel had been right all along. But nothing manifested. The corners remained corners, dark and dusty and thoroughly ordinary. Rodriguez locked the door behind us as we left, and we climbed the stairs back to the lobby in silence. Before he went back to his apartment, he turned to me and said, "The new tenant in Daniel's unit? He gave notice last week. Says he got a better opportunity across town, but I've seen that look before. He's seen them too." I wanted to ask what it meant, seeing them, if it was a symptom or a warning or simply a quirk of perception that some people had and others didn't. But Rodriguez was already walking away, and I was suddenly too tired to chase after answers that might not exist. Back in my apartment, I made coffee I wouldn't drink and watched the sun rise through my living room window, painting the building across the street in shades of pink and orange. Flame colors. The city woke up around me, the sounds of traffic and distant sirens creating a familiar backdrop of urban normalcy. In daylight, with the world fully illuminated and functioning, the night's fears seemed manageable, reducible to stress and exhaustion and the power of suggestion. But I knew that when darkness came again, I'd be watching the corners, waiting for the shimmer, wondering if the orange glow I sometimes thought I saw was reflected light from outside, or residual charge in wiring that should have been dead, or something else entirely, something that lived in the angles of old buildings and fed on the attention of those few people unlucky or sensitive enough to notice it. Daniel had noticed. He'd tried to tell me. And when the building had finally revealed itself through that electrical fire, through smoke and char and the irrefutable evidence of danger in the walls, his family had fled with a wisdom I'd mistaken for cowardice. I should have laughed less, should have listened more, should have asked the questions that might have prepared me for the moment when the corners of my own apartment began to burn with a light that had no source, a heat that couldn't be measured, a presence that existed in the space between rational explanation and lived experience. The coffee went cold in my cup as I sat there, watching my corners, waiting for the flames that I both hoped to see and dreaded seeing. Because confirmation would mean I wasn't crazy, but it would also mean that Daniel had been right about everything, including the fear, including the need to leave, including the understanding that some truths are better left unexplored in buildings that remember their fires long after the flames have gone out. The sun climbed higher, the shadows shifted, and in the corner where the north wall met the ceiling, where the paint was just slightly darker than it should have been, I thought I saw, for just a moment so brief I might have imagined it, a flicker of orange light that existed nowhere but in the angle itself, burning from the inside out. Story 8. The ceiling fan counted rotations above me. Three blades cutting humid air in lazy circles that did nothing to cool the apartment. 2 in the afternoon wasn't my usual time for sleep, but the heat had pressed against my temples until lying down felt less like choice and more like surrender. The couch cushions had molded around my body, and somewhere between the 12th and 13th rotation of the fan, I'd slipped under. I woke to the certainty of another presence, not the vague feeling you get on a subway platform or the prickling awareness of eyes in a crowded room. This was specific, immediate, the kind of knowledge that bypasses your rational mind and floods directly into your spine. Someone stood behind the couch, inches from the crown of my head, leaning over to look at my face. I jerked upright, breath catching in my throat like a fishhook. The room assembled itself in fragments. Coffee table, television reflecting the window's glare, the forgotten water glass leaving a ring on yesterday's mail. Empty. Completely empty. My phone screen glowed on the arm of the couch. 2:52 p.m. The alarm I'd set for 3 hadn't gone off yet. 8 minutes early. My heart hammered against my ribs hard enough to hurt, that particular ache that comes when adrenaline dumps into a body that hasn't moved. I stood up too fast and had to grip the couch back until the gray static cleared from my vision. The apartment maintained its ordinary silence, traffic humming 3 stories below, the neighbor's television murmuring through shared walls, the building's old pipes ticking as they expanded in the heat. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. I checked behind the couch anyway, feeling foolish even as I did it. Dust bunnies and a pen cap. I walked through the apartment's other rooms, bedroom with its unmade bed and pile of clean laundry I'd been meaning to fold for 3 days, bathroom where humidity still clung to the mirror from my morning shower, kitchen with its accumulation of coffee cups and the faint vinegar smell of fruit going bad in the bowl on the counter. Empty. Obviously empty. I'd locked the door when I came home, checked it twice the way I always did since someone in the building had mentioned a break-in 2 months ago. The windows were all latched, nothing disturbed. I returned to the living room and picked up my phone to dismiss the alarm that hadn't rung yet. 3 texts from my mother. I didn't open them immediately. My mother texted in paragraphs, dense blocks about family gossip or political outrage or recipes she'd seen online that she thought I should try. I needed coffee before tackling whatever dissertation waited in those message bubbles. The Keurig sputtered and spat, producing something that approximated coffee if you didn't think too hard about it. I leaned against the counter and opened the texts. The first one was time-stamped 2:47 p.m. Call me when you can. It's about Aunt Diane. The second, 2:48 p.m. Actually, just call me now. It's important. The third, 2:49 p.m. She passed this afternoon, around 2:30. I'm sorry to tell you this way, but I wanted you to know before someone else mentioned it. I read the messages 3 times, my eyes catching on specific words, passed, afternoon, 2:30, while the rest of my brain tried to process around them. Aunt Diane, my mother's older sister, the one who'd lived in that narrow house in Pittsburgh with the steep stairs and wallpaper that probably hadn't been changed since the 70s. I'd seen her at Christmas maybe 2 years ago. She'd seemed fine then, healthy, had talked about her garden and a trip she wanted to take to Ireland to see where their grandmother had been born. I called my mother. She answered on the first ring with that particular breathless quality that meant she'd been crying and was trying not to. She explained how the hospice nurse had found Diane unresponsive during the afternoon check, how it had been peaceful and expected, though this was the first I'd heard that hospice had been involved at all, how the family had decided not to tell everyone because they hadn't wanted people to worry or feel obligated to travel during her final weeks. My mother's voice carried that slight lilt of her childhood accent, the one that only surfaced when she was emotional. She mentioned Scottish superstitions her own mother used to tell her, something about sentinels and warnings and the way the dying sometimes reached out to say goodbye to those they'd been close to. I made appropriate sounds, said I was sorry, asked if she needed anything. The conversation followed its expected groove, and when we hung up 15 minutes later, I felt the particular emptiness that comes after processing news that hasn't quite settled into reality yet. I sat at the kitchen table and finished my coffee, which had gone lukewarm. The apartment felt different now, not empty, occupied in a way that made my skin feel too tight. I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision, turning to find nothing. The light seemed wrong, too yellow and thick, like I was seeing it through old glass. The couch where I'd napped still held the depression of my body. I walked over and stood behind it, trying to recreate the angle, the proximity. If someone had actually been standing there, leaning over me, they would have been exactly where I was now, close enough to feel their breath, close enough to touch. I pressed my palm against the back of my neck, where I'd felt that presence. The skin was cooler than the rest of me, the fine hairs standing on end. 2:30. My mother had said around 2:30. I'd woken at 2:52. The fan continued its rotation, blades cutting the same air in the same pattern, and I watched it until my eyes watered. People died every second of every day. Thousands of them. Millions if you counted the whole world. The fact that I'd woken from a nap feeling unsettled at roughly the same time my aunt had died in a city 300 miles away was coincidence. Statistical probability. The human brain's desperate need to find patterns in chaos. I told myself this while I stood in my kitchen and watched the light change as the afternoon wore on. I told myself this while I microwaved dinner and ate it standing at the counter because sitting at the table made my back feel exposed. I told myself this while I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the building settle around me. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, I dreamed of nothing. The next morning arrived with the ordinary violence of my alarm, 6 a.m., 10 snoozes, the eventual acceptance that getting up was inevitable. Work absorbed the day in its usual way, and I managed to go several hours without thinking about the nap or my aunt or the way my apartment had felt too small and too occupied. But that evening, coming home to the same rooms, I felt it again. That awareness, that certainty of not being alone. I stood in my doorway with my hand still on the knob, keys dangling from my fingers. The apartment looked exactly as I'd left it. Dishes in the sink, that pile of laundry still unfolded on the bedroom chair, the couch cushions askew from where I'd sat that morning eating cereal and watching the news. But something had shifted. Some fundamental quality of the space had changed in a way I couldn't articulate. I walked through each room like I had the day before, checking windows and closets and behind the shower curtain. Nothing. No signs of entry. No disturbance. My laptop sat where I'd left it, wallet and keys on the entry table, television remote in its permanent position wedged between couch cushions. I made dinner. I watched a show I'd been meaning to catch up on. I did all the ordinary things that make up an evening alone, and beneath it all ran a current of wrongness I couldn't shake. At 11 p.m., I stood at the bathroom sink brushing my teeth and caught movement in the mirror. I spun around, foam dripping down my chin, to find the bathroom empty behind me. The shower curtain hung motionless, the towel on its hook. When I turned back to the mirror, my reflection looked wrong somehow. The eyes slightly too wide, the skin slightly too pale, like I was looking at a photograph of myself taken in harsh light. I rinsed my mouth and went to bed. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the dark and listened to the building's nighttime symphony, pipes expanding and contracting, someone walking across the floor above me, traffic passing on the street below, normal sounds, familiar sounds. But underneath them I heard something else, or thought I did. A breath that didn't match my own rhythm, a weight settling on the floor just outside my bedroom door. I turned on the bedside lamp. Empty hallway beyond the open door. I got up and checked anyway, padding through the apartment in my boxers and t-shirt, turning on every light, looking behind every door and piece of furniture large enough to conceal a person. Nothing. Always nothing. I left the lights on and went back to bed. This became a pattern. Each evening, coming home to that sense of occupancy. Each night, lying awake and listening to sounds that might have been nothing. I started sleeping with my bedroom door closed, then locked. I unplugged the lamps in the living room so their soft glow wouldn't cast shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't. I stopped napping entirely, even when exhaustion made my vision blur, because the thought of losing consciousness during daylight hours filled me with a dread I couldn't name. My mother called frequently in the days following the funeral, which I'd attended in a fog of too little sleep and too much coffee. She wanted to make sure I was coping, wanted to share memories of her sister, wanted to process her grief aloud in the way that helped her. I let her talk and made appropriate sounds and tried not to mention that I'd been waking at 2:52 a.m. every night for a week, my body locked rigid and my heart racing, certain that someone stood at the foot of my bed. When I turned on the light, no one was ever there. But the certainty remained. That specific visceral knowledge, I was being watched. I started noticing other things, small displacements, a cup in the kitchen sink that I didn't remember using, the bathroom door open when I could have sworn I'd closed it, a chair pulled slightly out from the table. Any one of these could have been my own forgetfulness, my brain short-circuiting from lack of sleep. All of them together formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. 2 weeks after my aunt's death, I came home to find every door in the apartment open. Bedroom door, bathroom door, the closet in the hallway. Even the cabinets in the kitchen stood ajar, their dark mouths gaping. I'd closed them all that morning. I remembered doing it, remembered that small click of the latch catching. I backed out of the apartment and called the police. The officers who responded were patient and thorough. They walked through every room, checked every window, examined the lock on my door for signs of tampering. Nothing. No forced entry, no evidence anyone had been inside. One of them, the younger guy with red hair and a smattering of freckles across his nose, suggested that maybe the building's HVAC system had created some kind of pressure differential that could pop open improperly latched doors. I nodded and thanked them, and saw them out, and after they left, I stood in my apartment and knew with absolute certainty that something had opened those doors, and it hadn't been air pressure. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat on my couch with every light on and watched the apartment for any sign of movement, any indication of presence. The hours stretched and warped. 3 a.m. became 4, became 5, and nothing happened except the slow dissolution of my certainty into the gray ambiguity of exhaustion. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe grief had triggered something in my brain, some neurological hiccup that made me paranoid and hypervigilant. Maybe I needed to talk to someone professional, get a prescription for something that would help me sleep, without this constant awareness of being observed. I called out of work the next day and made an appointment with a therapist my insurance covered. The earliest opening was 3 weeks away. I took it and tried to convince myself I could make it that long. The dreams started that night. Not dreams of being watched or followed. Dreams of standing at the foot of my own bed, looking down at myself sleeping. Dreams where I walked through my apartment in darkness, running my fingers along the walls and feeling the texture of the paint, the slight roughness where I'd patched holes from previous tenants. Dreams so vivid that I woke disoriented, unsure which version of reality was true. In one, I stood behind the couch where I'd napped that first afternoon and looked down at myself, sleeping. I leaned forward, close enough to see the small scar on my temple from when I'd fallen off my bike as a teenager, close enough to count the individual whiskers of stubble on my jaw, close enough to reach out and touch. I woke gasping, my hands clutching the sheets, my skin clammy with sweat. The bedroom was dark except for the thin light bleeding under the door from the living room. I'd left the lamp on again. I always left the lamp on now. I got up and walked to the bathroom, my legs unsteady, and when I passed the living room I stopped. Someone sat on the couch. I could see them through the doorway. A figure, indistinct in the low light, sitting exactly where I'd been that afternoon 2 weeks ago. Not moving, just sitting, facing away from me, looking at the television that wasn't on. My breath stopped. My heart stopped. Everything stopped except my vision, which sharpened with impossible clarity, taking in every detail. The way the lamplight caught the curve of a shoulder, the slight rise and fall that might have been breathing, the shadow it cast across the coffee table. I blinked. Empty couch, rumpled cushions, no figure, no shadow, but I could still feel it. That presence, that certainty that I wasn't alone. I backed into my bedroom and closed the door and locked it and shoved my desk chair under the handle the way people do in movies. I climbed into bed and pulled the covers up and lay there trembling until light seeped around the edges of my blackout curtains. and I could pretend morning had made everything safe again. I didn't leave my bedroom until 8 a.m. When I finally emerged, the apartment looked normal, felt normal. Whatever had been there during the night had dissipated with the darkness, leaving only ordinary rooms filled with ordinary light. I called my mother that afternoon, hoping she might be able to explain the things her grandmother had told her, those Scottish superstitions about sentinels and warnings. She seemed pleased I'd called and launched immediately into a story about how her grandmother used to say that the dying could send pieces of themselves ahead to prepare their loved ones, to soften the blow of grief. It was considered a gift, she said, this final visitation. A way of saying goodbye. I asked her what happened if the visitation didn't stop, if it kept happening after the person had died. The pause stretched long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, become smaller. She said her grandmother used to tell another story, one she'd always dismissed as meant to scare children into good behavior, something about how sometimes the dying couldn't find their way forward and got stuck in the between places, tethered to the moment of their passing, reaching out again and again to the last person they'd touched. I felt cold despite the afternoon heat. I asked her what happened to that person, the one they'd reached out to. Another pause. Then she said she didn't really remember. It had just been an old woman's stories. Nothing based in anything real. We should focus on the good memories of Diane. We should celebrate her life. We should be grateful she'd gone peacefully. We talked for another few minutes, but I could hear the discomfort in her voice, the desire to be done with this particular thread of conversation. When we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and thought about that moment of waking on the couch, that certainty of presence, the way it had felt so specific and immediate and real. 2:52 p.m., 8 minutes before my alarm, 22 minutes after my aunt had died. I stood up and walked to the couch and placed my hand on the back of it, right where someone would have stood to lean over and look at my sleeping face. The fabric was warm from the sun streaming through the window, nothing more. But beneath my palm, I could swear I felt something else, a coolness, a texture that didn't quite match the upholstery, a presence. I pulled my hand away. That night I packed a bag and checked into a hotel downtown, a bland corporate place with key cards and ice machines and the anonymity of identical rooms stacked 30 floors high. I thought distance might help. I thought maybe breaking the pattern, sleeping somewhere else, might reset whatever had gotten tangled in my apartment. I slept for 12 hours and woke feeling more human than I had in weeks. The second night, I woke at 2:52 a.m. to the certainty that someone stood at the foot of the hotel bed. I turned on every light in the room, the bedside lamp, the bathroom light, the overhead fixture with its energy-efficient bulbs that hummed slightly. Empty room, generic art on the walls, my suitcase in the corner, the television reflecting my own haggard face. But the feeling remained, that specific, undeniable awareness. I sat on the bed and put my head in my hands and tried to think rationally, tried to find the logical explanation. Grief could do strange things to people. Lack of sleep could cause hallucinations. The mind was capable of creating entire realities that didn't exist. But this felt different. This felt like something had followed me, like I'd become tethered to a moment. That moment of waking on my couch, that instant when whatever had been standing behind me had looked down at my sleeping face and reached out. And now it couldn't stop reaching. I checked out of the hotel the next morning and went back to my apartment, because running hadn't helped and staying somewhere else wouldn't either. Whatever this was, it had attached itself to me, not to the place. I was carrying it with me, this awareness, this presence. The apartment felt different when I returned. Not hostile exactly, just occupied, claimed. Like I was the visitor now and something else had been living here in my absence, settling into the spaces I'd vacated. I put my bag down and walked through the rooms, and everything was exactly as I'd left it. But the quality of the air had changed. The light fell differently. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper. I went to the couch and sat down exactly where I'd been sleeping that afternoon 3 weeks ago. I closed my eyes and tried to recreate the position, the angle, the way my head had rested against the arm cushion. I stayed very still and listened. The building hummed around me. The fan counted rotations overhead. Traffic passed 3 stories below. And beneath it all, I heard breathing that wasn't mine. I opened my eyes. The apartment looked the same. Empty. Ordinary. Mine. But I wasn't alone anymore. Would never be alone again. Something had reached out to say goodbye and gotten stuck halfway, trapped in that moment of passing, endlessly repeating the gesture. And I was the one it had touched. I could feel it now. That presence behind me, just past my line of sight, close enough to feel the chill of it against the back of my neck. I didn't turn around. I knew what I wouldn't see. The clock on my phone read 2:52 p.m. The alarm I'd never dismissed 3 weeks ago began to ring. And behind me, impossibly close, something leaned forward to look at my face. Story 9. The flight to Seattle took 6 hours, but the unease started before I even boarded. Rebecca had called 3 times in 2 days, her voice carrying that particular tremor I recognized from our college years, the one that meant something was wrong, though she'd never say what. When I finally agreed to visit, the relief in her voice felt almost desperate. I hadn't seen her in nearly 8 years. Life had pulled us in different directions after graduation, the way it does, until friendship becomes birthday texts and annual holiday messages. But her apartment in Capitol Hill brought back memories of late-night study sessions and philosophical debates that stretched until dawn. The building was older than I expected, a converted warehouse with exposed brick and pipes running along the ceiling like metal veins. She looked thinner than I remembered. Her eyes had developed dark crescents underneath, and her hands moved constantly, adjusting her hair, straightening objects on the coffee table, rubbing her arms as though perpetually cold. The apartment smelled of lavender and something else, something stale beneath the pleasant surface, like flowers trying to mask decay. That first night, she made dinner while I unpacked in her guest room. The space was sparse but comfortable, with a window overlooking the alley behind the building. As I arranged my clothes in the dresser, I heard her drop something in the kitchen, followed by the sharp intake of breath people make when trying not to cry. When I came out, she was picking up pieces of a broken plate, her fingers trembling. "Everyone thinks I'm losing it," she said without looking up. The words came fast, as though she'd been holding them in for months. "They say things follow me. That weird stuff happens when I'm around." I helped her clean up the ceramic shards, noting how she kept glancing toward the hallway, how her shoulders tensed at every small sound. Later, over reheated pasta, she told me about objects moving when she wasn't looking, about electrical problems that repair workers couldn't explain, about the feeling of being watched in empty rooms. Her roommate had moved out 3 months ago. 2 friends had stopped calling. Her boyfriend had left without explanation. The rational part of my mind cataloged explanations. Stress, isolation, maybe depression manifesting as paranoid thoughts. But I nodded and listened because that's what old friends do. They show up. They suspend judgment. Around midnight, I was reading in the guest room when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. The kind that announce a person's presence. I assumed Rebecca was going to the bathroom or getting water. But the steps didn't move past my door. They stopped right outside it. I waited for a knock that never came. The footsteps resumed, pacing back and forth, back and forth. The floorboards creaked with weight. I could track the movement by sound alone. A slow patrol from one end of the hall to the other. It went on for what felt like 10 minutes. I was about to call out when I noticed the gap beneath the door. A shadow moved there. Not the diffuse darkness of someone standing nearby, but a distinct shape, dense and deliberate, sliding along the crack like water seeking a drain. It moved from left to right, then back again, independent of any visible form. My breath caught. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a draft moving something in the hall, anything but what my eyes insisted they were seeing. The shadow paused directly in front of my door. I could feel attention focused on me through 4 inches of wood, could sense scrutiny so intense it raised the hair on my arms. My phone lay on the nightstand, its screen dark. The digital clock read 12:47. Time felt suspended, stretched thin. Then the shadow moved on, and the footsteps resumed, fading toward the far end of the apartment. I heard Rebecca's door open and close. Silence settled like dust. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the old building jerked me toward consciousness. Twice I thought I heard whispers, but when I held my breath to listen, there was nothing. Or maybe there was something just below the threshold of hearing. Syllables dissolved in static. The next morning, Rebecca looked as exhausted as I felt. Over coffee, I almost asked about the nighttime pacing, but her expression stopped me. She had the wary, brittle quality of someone expecting to be called crazy, so I swallowed the question and suggested we get out of the apartment. We spent the day like tourists, visiting Pike Place Market and the waterfront, eating overpriced seafood and pretending normalcy. But I caught her checking over her shoulder, stiffening when we passed reflective surfaces, as though she expected to see something that shouldn't be there. In the Space Needle elevator, she gripped my arm so tightly, her nails left half-moons on my skin. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. "It's here." I felt only the motion of the ascending elevator and the press of tourists around us. But her fear was palpable, infectious. By the time we reached the observation deck, I found myself scanning the crowd, looking for what? Someone watching us? Something? That evening, I researched sleep disorders and stress-induced hallucinations. The internet offered reasonable explanations. Pareidolia, sleep paralysis, hypnagogic states. I felt better armed with terminology, with science. I would help her understand that these experiences had logical roots, that she wasn't losing her mind or being haunted. But that second night, around 1:15 a.m., the shadow returned. This time I was ready for it. I'd positioned myself near the door, phone in hand, determined to document or debunk. The footsteps started the same way, that heavy, deliberate tread. The shadow appeared beneath the door, thicker than any normal shadow should be, moving with purpose. I recorded video, though in the darkness my phone's camera captured only grainy footage of the door's lower edge. But I could see it clearly with my own eyes. That ribbon of darkness flowing back and forth, pausing, resuming. I reached for the doorknob. The shadow stopped moving. My hand hovered inches from the knob. Every instinct screamed against opening the door, though I couldn't articulate why. The shadow remained perfectly still, and in that stillness I sensed waiting, anticipation. Something wanted me to open the door. I pulled my hand back. The shadow rippled like disturbed water, then slid away. The footsteps receded. I checked the footage later. The video showed nothing but a dim strip of space beneath the door. No shadow, no movement, just my own ragged breathing on the audio track. I left Seattle 2 days later, my visit cut short by an invented work emergency. Rebecca hugged me at the airport with trembling arms, and I promised to call soon. The lie felt necessary and cruel. For 3 months, I almost convinced myself it had been fatigue, suggestion, the power of expectation creating false patterns. I'd fallen under the spell of her anxiety, let her fears infect my perceptions. I threw myself into work, into routines, into the solid reassurance of ordinary life. Then the doors started slamming. It began small. My apartment door would close harder than I remembered shutting it, the frame rattling in its housing. I blamed drafts, blamed the building's ventilation system. But then the bedroom door slammed at 12:47 a.m., jolting me from sleep. I lived alone. I'd installed good locks after a break-in 2 buildings ago. Nobody had keys but me. The next night, the bathroom door, then the closet, always between midnight and 2 a.m., always with that same decisive bang, as though someone were making a point. I set up cameras. They showed the doors closing of their own accord, no strings, no drafts strong enough to explain the force. I called a contractor, who found nothing wrong with the hinges or frames. I had the building manager inspect the ventilation. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. Except for the doors, which kept slamming at hours that meant something. I started logging the times. 12:47, 1:15, 1:33. Rebecca's bedtime, her usual wake-up for water, the hour she once told me she felt most afraid. The pattern was too specific to be random. I didn't call her. What would I say? That I believed her now? That whatever followed her had found me? The idea was absurd, the logic of superstition and paranoia. But then came the night I felt the weight on my bed. I woke to pressure moving across the comforter, a distinct sensation of footsteps, light but unmistakable. The indentations traveled from the foot of the bed toward my head, carefully avoiding my legs as though navigating around obstacles in darkness. My breath stopped, my muscles locked, the mattress depressed and released, a slow progression. The weight reached my shoulder and paused. I lay perfectly still, eyes closed, feeling presence like heat against my face. Breath that wasn't breath stirred my hair. A sound filled the silence, not quite a whisper, not quite static, something linguistic hovering just beyond comprehension. Then nothing. The weight lifted. The room felt empty again. I turned on every light in the apartment and sat on the couch until dawn, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My hands shook. My rational mind offered explanations, stress, suggestion, the power of Rebecca's delusions to plant seeds that grew in isolation. But my body knew something my mind refused to accept. I called her at 6 a.m. She answered on the first ring, as though she'd been awake, waiting. I described everything, the shadow, the doors, the weight on the bed. She listened without interruption, without surprise. It started with doors for me, too, she said finally. Her voice was calmer than I'd ever heard it, the calm of someone no longer fighting. After you left, they stopped slamming at my place. The implication hung between us like smoke. I didn't mean for this, she continued. I didn't know it could transfer. That visiting me would... I ended the call. I couldn't hear the rest, couldn't process the suggestion that proximity to her had somehow marked me, that whatever haunted her had learned my scent. For 2 weeks I avoided sleep when I could. I worked double shifts. I drank enough caffeine to make my heart race. The doors kept slamming. The shadow appeared beneath different doorways now. Bathroom, bedroom, front door, always watching, always waiting. I researched attachment, spiritual contagion, the psychology of shared delusions. I found no comfort in any of it. Either I was experiencing a genuine supernatural phenomenon, or I was descending into the same mental fracture that had consumed Rebecca. Both options terrified me equally. Tonight, sitting in my apartment with every light blazing, I heard footsteps in my own hallway. Heavy, deliberate, pacing back and forth outside my bedroom door. I watched the shadow slide beneath it, dark and purposeful, so much denser than any ordinary darkness. I haven't opened the door. I won't open the door. But I wonder, as I watch that strip of shadow move with apparent awareness, which possibility frightens me more? That something impossible has attached itself to me, following me the way it followed Rebecca, or that my mind has found a pattern where none exists, creating monsters